8. The rightward drift of the AFL and the temporary decline of the Hours issue, 1887 to 1908. During the 2 decades following Haymarket, numerous changes altered the character of the 8-hour movement. The de facto bloc of center and left trade unionists which had built 8-hour agitation in the 1870s and early 1880s split in the wake of post-Haymarket repression. The decline of the Knights of Labor decimated for a time the size of the organized labor movement and limited the enlisting of the unskilled, blacks, women, and immigrants, key elements in any class-wide drive for a shorter working day. The AFL gradually adopted strategies befitting a narrow craft unionism, rejecting the mass strike as an 8-hour tactic and, especially after 1894, largely ignoring political action as means to reform working conditions. Thus, the labor movement entered the 20th century without the tactical flexibility and militancy that had characterized its 19th century stance regarding the working day. The absence of ongoing political active ITY around the question of hours made 8-hour agitation episodic, so much so that one historian has even suggested that rank-and-file workers lacked interest in the 8-hour demand by 1890.1. In such a situation, the increasing numbers of women in the labor force occupied a key position as the most innovative shorter hours advocates. Both feminists and labor groups raised the issue, often in productive counterpoint. However, AFL reluctance to organize females, or even to admit that women had a place in the workforce, contributed to middle-class domination of the feminist labor coalition. In contrast to early labor leaders like Seth Luther and Sarah Bagley, who saw the shortening of hours for women as bound up with the increased leisure and power of all workers, Gompers and feminists in the National Consumers League shared a perspective which stressed the alleged need to protect females and, as Gompers argued, to return them to the home. Another contribution to the recasting of the hours issue as one not based on divergent class interests was the growth of a professional group of reformers, especially factory inspectors and labor statisticians. These reformers ostensibly stood outside of class conflict and generally encouraged voluntary reforms in the working day based on the arguments of efficiency and health. Combined with the PAR 145. Teal decline of working-class cultural institutions, in the face of the crumbling of the culturally creative Knights of Labor, of the coming of professional and middle-class domination of many ethnic cultural institutions, and the growth of mass culture, this reform ideology made labor's leisure seem less a threat to some employers. Point 2. As recreational theorists argued that leisure could contribute to Americanization of immigrants and to labor discipline, and as Frederick Winslow Taylor theorized on the compatibility of reduced hours and more productive ITY, a tiny number of manufacturers and a larger number of progressive liberals came to embrace a voluntary reduction in working hours. The last years of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th thus saw a series of changes which softened bourgeois opinion on the working day. Suburbanization, progressive ideas regarding leisure, the early growth of scientific management, and the development of labor statistics and labor economics as professions contributed to an intellectual climate in which shortening the working day could be approached not as a class issue but as a reform worthy of consideration on the grounds of efficiency, uplift, and safety. Some sectors of management, many professionals, a few important early progressive politicians, and a small minority of industrial enterprises came to favor abridging the length of work. The movement of upper and middle class people from the central city to suburbs, a migration which accelerated in the major metropolitan areas, made working-class leisure less threatening. Neighborhoods in the physically small cities of the mid-19th century often included rich and poor within a short walk or earshot of each other. With the growth of class-segregated suburbs, often with private single-family homes, elite concern over the after-hours behavior of workers took different forms. Arguments by employers that less hours meant more working-class drinking, noise, and vice were less urgent. Desire to order the lives of workers more often found expression in plans to shape the leisure of the lower classes, not in a crude determination to limit that leisure. Point 3. From the 1860s and earlier, reformers had argued that control over institutions of leisure and play could help ensure class peace. Similarly, since the 1850s, society as a whole and reformers in particular had backed off slightly from a single-minded stress on the curative properties of hard work and found some value in what Herbert Spencer called the gospel of relaxation. Daniel T. Rogers, whose work ethic in industrial America treats play as well, observes, slowly and hesitantly many middle-class northerners abandoned the idea of a world so cramped and dangerous that social and psychological health demanded constant doing. In its place they turned their imaginations to metaphors of surplus. Such trends found expression in the 1890s in pro-play movements for more parks, for school sports, and for organized childhood leisure. The progressive recreation movement was one such pro-play movement. Moreover, the 1890s witnessed a bicycling craze, the rise of modem baseball, a mania for college athletics, especially football, and the growth of popular cultural institutions like Coney Island. Point 4. The desire to recapture the virtues of play in a hardworking, industrial, capital East society inevitably embodied great contradictions. That Theodore Roosevelt could be seen as a playful hero suggests how deeply Puritan, masculine, and capitalist attitudes toward work influenced attitudes toward play, producing in Roosevelt the idea that strenuous play was best. Coney Island itself, according to one recent historian, sought to counteract weariness and boredom by prescribing a homeopathic remedy of intense, frenetic physical activities without imaginative demands. The Russian writer Maxim Gorky, a visitor in 1906, described the ethos of the island as based on American workers' attitude that life is made for the people to work 6 days in the week, sin on the seventh, and pay for their sins, confess their sins and pay for the confession. Professional advocates of recreation often argued not for play per se but for play as a means to secure higher productivity, obedience to authority, and even Americanization of immigrants. 5. Coinciding with the new emphasis on leisure came a series of changes in management which held out the possibility of dramatically increasing working time and productivity within the confines of a given working day. These changes are usually grouped under the heading of Taylorism but were broader than the theories of scientific management advanced by Frederick Winslow Taylor. The time clock, for example, came into common use during the early 1890s, providing an easy way to keep track of tardiness and breaks. 6. However, Taylor was the most influential innovator in management strategy and the most attentive to the idea that management control over small units of time and over the rhythm of work was central to reordering the work process. Insisting that his system was one of time-saving, Taylor wrote of the trebling and more of production in the same number of hours and with virtually the same technology through the wresting of the control of the pace of production from workers, recruitment of adaptive laborers, and payment of premium bonuses. Taylor himself sometimes held that to make shorter working hours was a goal of scientific management. Although few employers using his method agreed and Taylor hardly pressed the issue, the idea that efficiency was compatible with a shorter working day appealed to some progressive reformers and especially to professional investigators of labor conditions. The old contention that rest led to increased productivity could now be stated with special force. Long hours signified the failure to adopt scientific, efficient management methods. 7. Such arguments found an audience among the new professionals studying labor. After an early period in which many leaders of state bureaus of labor statistics openly supported labor demands, especially in states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri where labor protests brought the agencies into being and socialists headed the bureaus, a professional class neutrality came to the bureaucracies, most notably through the agency of the National Association of Factory Inspectors, NAFI, founded in 1887. At NAFI's second convention, Massachusetts reformer Rufus Wade set the pattern for the inspectors argue ments for shorter hours. He held that no success had come to the shorter hours advocates until scientific knowledge proved long days unprofitable to the owner, and maintained that the problem was in a fair way to settlement, now that it was shown that a reduction of the hours of labor meant better results, both as to the amount of production and quality of it. 2 years later, a Maine labor statistician, L.R. Campbell, began his speech to NAFI favoring 10-hour laws by observing, "It is evident to every thinking person that it is impracticable to reduce the hours of labor in a manner whereby the world's product is curtailed or lessened in the least," but his moderate resolution still passed by just 2 votes over the opposition of a conservative bloc desiring to have the inspectors only interchange views and not make recommendations. 9. To reform-minded inspectors like Josephine Goldmark and reform-minded academics like John R. Commons, scientific management offered sanction for the idea of progress through harmony of capital and labor, and through greater efficiency. Seeing labor opposition to Taylorism as misguided, these reformers embraced scientific management as the key to less hours. Even as late as 1912, when evidence was in that Taylorism did not reduce the working day, Goldmark could write, "Excessive hours are marks of inefficiency." That scientific management itself has shortened the working day in fair proportion to the increased productivity of its workers, no one can justly maintain. In regard to hours and conditions, the new system still has to share its marvelous gains more equitably with labor. 10. Those progressive politicians who embraced shorter hours or showed some flexibility on the issue, especially Louis Brandeis and Theodore Roosevelt, shared a fascination with scientific management and labor efficiency in general. The most impressive early progressive document to feature an appeal for shorter hours was the 1902 report of the U.S. Industrial Commission. Established by Congress in 1898, the commission spent nearly 4 years gathering data from 700 witnesses and from state labor reports. Its conclusions included a long section on the working day, which collected evidence that a shorter day increased production and left employer and employee agreed upon the advantages of the change. The commission backed a reduction in the length of labor for those working over 8 hours and directly suggested that workers trade control over their work for shorter hours. The entire tendency for industry is in the direction of increased exertion. Any restriction on output must work to the disadvantage of American industry, and the employers are often right in their demand, usually successful, that such restrictions be abandoned. This being true, there is but one alternative: a reduction of the hours of labor. 12. Such a stress on the connection between leisure and efficiency might have been expected to produce a boom in legislative restriction on hours and voluntary reductions in the working day. That it did not testifies to the continuing depth of employer opposition to reform. The Industrial Commission report of 1901 cited only a single, minor example of voluntary reduction of hours by an employer since a similar report 15 years earlier. The report missed a few other instances of voluntary reform before 1901, the National Cash Register Company cut hours to 8 for women workers. A Fitchburg, Massachusetts, ball bearing manufacturer instituted the 8.5 hour day. FEI's N. Company, soap makers in Philadelphia, granted the 8-hour day to women. The visionary, profit-sharing N.O. Nelson Company in LeClaire, Illinois, operated on 9-hour shifts making plumbing supplies. The Solvay Process Company of Syracuse adopted an 8-hour shift at its Syracuse steel mills in 1892. Shoe manufacturers in Boston, 1898, and Philadelphia, 1901, instituted the 9 and 8-hour day respectively. After 1901, examples of voluntary action multiplied only slowly. Armor Fertilizer moved to an 8-hour schedule between 1901 and 1905. In 1904, the Sharon Steel Hoop Company reduced hours from 10 to 8. The biggest Minneapolis flour mills began the 8-hour day in 1902, and the International Time Recording Company made a transition to a 9-hour day. These cases hardly balanced the aggressive record of individual capitalists and employer associations who still fought against shorter hours. 13. The clearest barometer of business opinion was the behavior of employer associations. The employers' associations, which grew dramatically in the early progressive era, often in response to the hours issue, focused their ire on shorter hours laws for women and federal employees. The Illinois Manufacturers Association, for example, consolidated around the opposition of employers to an 1893 statute enforcing an 8-hour day for women workers and dwelled on that issue through 1913. Employer cooperation in California similarly accelerated in 1900 with the campaign against 8-hour legislation for women. 14. Leading the anti-labor offensive was the National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, whose opposition to an 8-hour bill for federal employees in 1902 signaled a change in the organization's philosophy. From its inception in 1895 until 1902, NAM had functioned as a lobby on trade and tariff policy. However, in the latter year, NAM president, David M. Perry, began an uncompromising campaign against all that he saw as evil in America: Gompersism, 8-hour laws, boycotts, anti-conspiracy laws, and the making of socialists by the A.F. of L. 15. Leading other employer groups in an open shop drive, designed to attack union strength, NAM first entered labor lobbying with a fierce attack on a bill which sought to strengthen the 1892 federal hours law by specifying that an 8-hour provision be written into all contracts for goods bought by the federal government. After sending a barrage of telegrams to Congress, NAM claimed credit for defeating the bill. For the next 15 years, NAM continued to battle for the American workman's right to work more than 480 minutes of a calendar day, referring to hours laws as arbitrary, needless, destructive, and dangerous. NAM found ready allies in other employer associations, especially the City Zen's Industrial Alliance, the National Metal Trades Association, and the League for Industrial Rights. 16. Another employers association, the National Civic Federation, NCF, included labor representatives and has sometimes been portrayed as representative of an enlightened corporate capitalist strategy which, in contrast to the small manufacturer-dominated NAM, undertook far-sighted programs of conciliation, welfare, and labor reform. But the NCF, founded in 1900, made small attempts to shorten the working day. While a few individual NCF leaders showed flexible ITY on the issue, they generally did so half-heartedly. For example, NCF leaders praised the 1900 Murray-Hill Agreement, which briefly brought labor peace between the International Association of Machinists and the National Metal Trades Association, and which gave the machinists the 54-hour week, but watched as the pact dissolved the next year when employers refused national bargaining over wages. 17. In 1902, some top NCF members from the steel industry supported the federal 8-hour law, but they may have done so, Norman Ware suggests, in return for Gompers's conservative influence in a strike. In 1905, NCF President August Belmont seized the occasion of the interborough transit strike, directed against a corporation he headed, not to grant the 9-hour day workers demanded but to break the union and institute an open shop. 18. Arguments, but not strategies, for shortening the working day found an occasional place in both NCF conventions and the organization's review. Particularly popular were materials produced by the ex-follower of Ira Stewart, George Gunton. By now a professor, Gunton became a leading exponent of business-labor cooperation during this period. His writings stressed the necessity of workers accepting Taylorism and unsatisfying work but held out shorter hours in return. The exhaustion of the laborer must be avoided, but it cannot be avoided by reducing production. They must have relief by lessening the duration of the pressure every day. 19. However, such appeals to efficiency-minded employers seldom led to NCF action. The organization did not support legislation on hours, even for children. Few of the leading corporate members, despite conciliatory rhetoric, bargained with unions after 1906 and voluntary reductions of hours remained rare. 20. The new context of the hours issue did not generate any significant softening of employer attitudes, and trade union action remained the dominant method of gaining concessions regarding the working day. AFL policy concerning the working day meanwhile changed subtly, but critically, during the 2 decades following Haymarket. Both the rationale for the 8-hour day and plans for inaugurating it shifted to more conservative grounds. After an early period of fluidity in which the AFL encouraged hours-leg isolation and mass strikes, the AFL came to limit its role in hours agitation to advocacy of legislation protecting special groups of workers, such as miners, backers, railwaymen, government employees, and women, and to doing support and educational work around hours strikes by individual craft unions. AFL leaders, especially Gompers, increasingly stressed the practical aims of eliminating unemployment and of increasing productivity in 8-hour propaganda, and less often emphasized the connection of hours with higher wages or with more visionary goals such as working-class self-education and labor political activity. In reviewing the positions of the AFL, it is necessary to observe that a range of considerations shaped the Federation's actions. Craft union leaders responded to pressures from other groups, including the Knights of Labor, the Socialist Labor Party, Socialist Party, and the Populists. They gauged the relative power of organized labor versus that of capital and often concluded that frontal assaults, like mass strikes or general legislation on hours, were unproductive in an age of vigilante violence, intervention into strikes by state and federal troops, and the court's use of frequent, successful legal challenges to protective labor laws. 21. They appealed to public opinion with arguments designed to win a broad hearing among not just workers but also the middle classes and progressive reform groups. Moreover, the AFL strategy was not wholly unsuccessful during these years. By one estimate, the average working week in all industries declined by 4.9 hours between 1890 and 1914.22. On the other hand, AFL policy was far from being solely the result of rational calculation concerning what was possible and what was best for trade unionism and for all American workers. It reflected the distrust of politics common to Gompers and many conservative craft leaders, a distrust fueled by an unwillingness to concede to socialist and populist opponents in the unions that a contest over control of the state was important. It also betrayed a narrow craft consciousness that neglected the demands of unskilled workers and discouraged sympathy strikes. The idea of a craft-by-craft march to the shorter working day, led by the most powerful unions, moving alone but with some monetary aid from the AFL, reflected the notion that mass solidarity actions were counterproductive. 23. The AFL's tactical conservatism stemmed also from a bias against immigrant labor, which, according to the conventional wisdom, could not be organized and actually favored long hours. A joke repeated by Chicago needle trades organizers regarding a greenhorn who heard of the union's call for an 8-hour day and responded approvingly but added that the organization would do even better to demand 16 hours, is instructive. 24. Such perceptions of immigrants became self-fulfilling prophecies which excused the AFL from organizing unskilled workers around hours. Significantly, Gompers interrupted the chapter on the working day in his memoir with a racist digression on San Francisco's Chinatown and a plea for immigration restriction. 25. The mixed motives and results of AFL policy on hours are best viewed in a sustained consideration of 3 aspects of that policy: arguments for the shorter day, rejection of independent political action by labor, the craft-by-craft strategy of securing the 8-hour day. A later section of this chapter considers AFL sexism and the shorter hours movement among women. The evolution of AFL thought on the 8-hour demand is difficult to summarize. Indeed, 2 serious treatments of the subject diverge in their conclusions. Henry Raymond Mussey's 1927 study of 8-hour theory in the AFL found that the ideas that 8 hours would cure unemployment and raise wages became less important in Federation statements between 1886 and 1900. The contention that shorter hours would increase productivity bulked larger as the century neared its end and, by 1900, with the publication of George A. Schilling's Less Hours, Increased Production, Great Progress, and Frank Foster's Sidelights on the Shorter Workday Demand, the AFL had virtually adopted the same grounds, productivity and creation of consumer market, that Henry Ford would later use to justify granting the 8-hour day. Daniel Rogers, on the other hand, has portrayed Gompers as fighting a holding action against two-off-the-century overemphasis on production and as claiming leisure as the right of those who have borne the awful strains and burdens of exacting toil. 26. Only after 1900, according to Rogers, did Gompers compromise the dream of less send toil by taking up the argument that the 8-hour workers would make up production losses by more efficient work. Both authors agree that by 1910 8-hour theory in the AFL was less creative and less passionate than it had been 1890. Mussey in particular observed a drop in the theoretical temperature of 8-hour appeals and, after a summary of 8-hour discussions at the 1906 convention, commented, "Verily the glory is departed from Israel." 27. However, a closer reading of AFL literature suggests that the lessening heat of shorter hours appeals stemmed from causes more complex than the emphasis on productivity. From the immediate post-Haymarket period, when the AFL published 3 noteworthy 8-hour pamphlets, the organization had generally full-load Ira Stewart's arguments that less hours would lead to innovation, to increased consumer demand, and, therefore, to productive advances. George McNeill, George Gunton, and Lemuel Danreed, authors of the pamphlets, were all decisively influenced by Stewart's ideas, with Gunton drawing most heavily on that side of Stewart's thought which implied that shorter hours would be good for all classes. 28 Gompers himself, in an 1888 statement, followed this line of thought, defining the hours of labor as an issue which creates the greatest revolution in the conditions of the people with the slightest frictions upon any, and commenting, in 1900, that every cut in hours leads to the introduction of a new machine, and to more production. 29. Thus emphasis on productivity was an ongoing theme inherited from Stewart, not a new invention of turn of the century theorists. However, for Stewart, McNeill, and others, the productive advances came as part of a lengthy process of technological advance, not as the simple result of fresher workers, achieving in 10 hours what had been done in 8. McNeill, for example, held that the day will never come when one can do as much in 8 hours as he might the day before or after in 10 hours labor, but maintained that in the long run shorter hours led to more demand, better technology, and more production. Similarly, for Stewart and McNeill, though not Gunton, shorter hours were owed to labor as a matter of justice quite aside from the question of productivity. 30. During periods of faith in cooperation with employers, and especially in the first years of the 20th century when labor leaders were fascinated by arbitration plans sponsored by the NCF, the AFL verged upon subsuming the class aspect of the issue of the working day, though it never quite did so absolutely. Thus Gompers might say, "We want no friction, our aim is to avoid conflict," but in the next breath observe, toilers recognize, however, that there are worse evils than strife. 31. As the rhetoric regarding productivity and class harmony changed slowly, so too did other aspects of 8-hour theory. Stewart's involved ideas on the working day existed alongside simpler notions regarding the desirability of shorter hours. The most popular of these were the simple formulae that less hours meant higher wages and more jobs. Although Stewart usually held that leisure created new demands for increased pay, most unionists probably understood the relationship between pay and hours in terms of shorter hours driving up wages by limiting the available workers and thus upping the demand for labor. In any case, as Mussey observes, the wage argument became less prominent after 1890. Craft leaders, anxious to demonstrate to employers that no one's interests suffered from shorter hours, shied away from stressing that wage raises would follow. Still, some union organizers hammered home the slogan that decreasing the work increases the pay. 32. Most dramatic was the change to the new preeminence accorded to unemployment as a reason for instituting the 8-hour day. Practical share the work arguments appealed during these years of frequent, serious depressions. Gompers reiterated that hours were too lengthy so long as even a sin glay worker was out of a job. This approach, which matured during the Dupree's Scion of 1893, enabled the AFL to continue to maintain that the 8-hour plank was also a wage demand, since wages were seen as set partly by the minimum remuneration an unemployed worker would take for doing a job. 33. The argument for shorter hours as a jobs measure also had public appeal. However, in all the AFL agitation for adjustment of the working day to combat joblessness, the Federation assumed that such changes were to result from the private actions of employers and unions. As productivity and unemployment bulked larger in AFL arguments, vision of a working class remade and fitted for power through self-education and political discourse during leisure hours receded. In part, this probably resulted from changes in cultural attitudes toward leisure discussed above, especially the growing perception of leisure as a mass activity shared by Americans of various classes. But it also reflected the limited goals of the AFL leadership and its distaste for radical visions and independent labor politics. Gompers might at times refer to the 8-hour day as a way to sharpen the perceptions of workers who were cattle, whose votes are purchased on election day, but he foresaw no great political transformations as a result of this change. An 1891 AFL document had stated, "The taste for freedom grows upon that on which it feeds, and would be oppressors of labor well know that if the wage earner is once given time to learn his own strength, he is thereby furnished with the weapons which shall secure for him industrial emancipation." 34. After 1900 such rhetoric gave way to more pedestrian arguments. In the wake of Haymarket, it seemed possible that the AFL would again consider political solutions to the problem of long hours. However, by 1887, Gompers and the Federation had withdrawn into a refusal to become involved in partisan activity on the United Labour Party's behalf. At AFL conventions, direct trade union action was the only tactic discussed seriously between 1886 and 1890 as a method for reducing hours for all workers. A deep distrust of the government remained a part of the craft unionists' assumptions. 8-hour laws made by politicians, remarked the carpenter in 1891, will never be observed by the employers. The only 8-hour law that will ever have binding force in this country will be made and enforced by the workingmen. 35 No other group challenged this assessment during the 7 years after Haymarket. The Dwin Dling Knights, and especially Powderly, still favored education and voluntary action, though they maintained a paper commitment to legislation. Edward Bellamy's nationalist clubs saw shorter hours as desirable but also as a diversion from the broader goals of their movement. Bellamy, in his work, Looking Backward, envisioned a system under which the labor hours were much fewer and fluctuated according to the difficulty of the task. The Socialist Labour Party emphasized a complex scheme of linking shorter hours to production increases or stressed the necessity of abolishing the entire wage system. 36. In 1894, the AFL leadership did come under serious challenge from a Labour Populist Socialist alliance which, among other political issues, posed the necessity of AFL agitation for a legal 8-hour workday. Using British Labour politics as a model, the Labour Populists endorsed independent political action around a broad platform and carried well over a third of the convention votes on the controversial Plank 10, advocating common ownership of the means of production and distribution, while passing 10 other reform planks including that on the 8-hour day. However, Gompers and the AFL leadership were able to defeat the program as a package and thus claim that votes for individual planks were invalid. Many socialists came to abandon the AFL in protest. 37 Gompers recognized the political potency of the 8-hour demand and responded by broadening the limited scope of AFL legislative activities around the issue. Thus, he added support for protective legislation for women and children at the national and state level to the existing AFL commitment to lobbying for well-enforced legislation applying to federal employees. 38. Although the Populists' People's Party did support 8-hour laws, their program was neither detailed nor their agitation energetic on the point. With the defection of socialists from the populist ranks and with the ultimate fusion of populism with the Democratic Party, any serious possibility for independent labor politics partly around the 8-hour plank disappeared. 39 The Socialist Party included 8-hour demands in its platforms and fought hard in several states for hours laws, but the socialists were handicapped in the early years by their lack of numerical strength at the polls and in most unions. 40 Moreover, some socialists were reluctant to push the 8-hour issue because it was seen as a palliative which, in the long run, if adopted, will have hardly any effect upon wages, profits, the unemployed and foreign commerce. 41 Thus the AFL national policy of limited legislative action on hours persisted without serious objection for nearly 2 decades after 1894, although local and state federations sometimes did endorse general 8-hour laws. 42. The record of legislative and judicial action regarding the working day during the early years of the AFL reinforced skepticism as to the possibility of political reform. Laws often contained loopholes or were unraveled by courts until such holes appeared. The pet project of the AFL, a statute applying to federal workers, is a prime example. The ineffective 1868 law providing the 8-hour day for government employees was strengthened somewhat in 1888 by specific acts requiring the public printer and the post office to observe that standard. The postal officials defied the law, which applied specifically to letter carriers, for 5 years, on the grounds that time working at the office should not be considered as part of the mailman's letter-carrying workday, before the courts upheld the postal employees. 43. Later rulings on the broader, AFL-sponsored 8-hour law of 1892, which specified that the 8-hour provision obtained on work contracted for by the government would not favor labor. The Supreme Court ruled that public works meant permanent, stationary structures owned by the government, and therefore, the law did not apply in such areas as privately owned shipyards and factories doing government work. Such decisions so outraged Gompers that he proposed that the AFL insist that all work for the government shall be performed by the government, without contractors. But the ruling stood, as did a loose interpretation of the emergency provision in the law which enabled contractors to claim that permanent emergencies existed during construction of levees and dams simply by virtue of the tendency of rivers to rise and fall. 44. In another major political test, in 1906 battle over whether the 8-hour standard would apply to work on the Panama Canal, the AFL appeared to be winning the legal fight, having secured a favorable opinion from the Attorney General, only to have Congress pass a canal appropriation bill with a rider nullifying the application of the law to Panama Canal construction. In addition, the AFL complained that federal authorities refused to enforce the law even when it did apply. 45. Other national legislative campaigns of the AFL faced equally stiff resistance. meant past Congress until 1924, when it was approved only to stall for lack of ratification by state legislatures. A decade of efforts by the railway unions, supported by the AFL, to achieve federal limitation on the hours of railroad workers eventuated in 1907 in the Hours of Service Act. Though important in establishing a precedent for federal intervention, that law allowed workers to be or remain on duty for up to 16 consecutive hours, 46. State laws also suffered in the courts. A statute that broke with tradition by not providing a loophole allowing contracts contravening the law passed the Nebraska legislature in 1891. The act, which called for overtime to be paid after 8 hours, was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court 3 years later. The court, in a precedent-setting decision, ruled that the law discriminated against certain trades by exempting domestic and farm laborers from its provisions and that it violated freedom of contract. 47 in many cases, especially in New York State. Courts even denied that states and municipalities could constitutionalize set hours and require that wages not be cut for 8-hour workers on Project ECTS for which they contracted. A landmark 1903 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Atkin v. Kansas reversed that trend, but on narrow grounds that specified that the rights of the state, not of workers, were being upheld. 48. Legislation to protect laborers in jobs where special health and safety considerations applied faced intense lobbying efforts from the industries and, if passed, drew court challenges. Only New York and California enacted a law protecting the public from overworked druggists and drug clerks during this period. California set 10 hours as a maximum length for a working day in pharmacies in 1901. Similar proposals surfaced in New York in 1898 and drew denunciation as a species of state socialism, before passing the legislature in 1901. 49 state laws limiting the hours of railroad workers generally enacted mandatory rest periods, ranging from 13 hours to a full day, between shifts. Such statutes, and the laws setting hours for street railwaymen in several states, were justified mainly in terms of public safety, a ground for legislation that the Rhode Island Supreme Court defined as constitutional in a 1902 case. However, legislation generally failed to ameliorate the long hours of street railwaymen. The transition from horse-drawn cars to electrically powered vehicles cut hours somewhat, but during and after the turn of the century, days of 13 and even 17 hours persisted, and the median working day for 345 surveyed companies was between 10 and 11 hours. A 1905 Bureau of Labor Statistics report found over 80% of street railway workers required to work on Sundays. 50. When legislation designed to protect workers in hazardous jobs came before the courts, decisions varied widely. The most significant early cases involved mining. Several western states, whose industrial economies revolved around mines and smelter, passed 8-hour laws during the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. In Utah, the AFL, the Western Federation of Miners, and Tom Kearns, a politically active mine owner who had begun his career as a miner, combined forces to secure the passage of an 8-hour law, which survived challenges in both the state and national Supreme Courts. The national decision in the landmark case of Holden v. Hardy explicitly recognized the disingenuousness of employers' arguments that hours laws violated the rights of workers. 51 But in Colorado, where populists had begun agitation on the matter in the early 1890s, the state Supreme Court twice declared 8-hour laws for miners to be unconstitutional, class legislation. In 1895, expressing an opinion on a proposed law before the legislature, the court found the statute violated freedom of contract. 4 years later, it held a virtually exact copy of Utah law to be unconstitutional, declaring, "It is beyond the power of the legislature, under the guise of the police power, to prohibit an adult man from working more than 8 hours, on the ground that working longer may injure his health." Despite a 3-to-1 margin in a popular vote in 1901 favoring an amendment to the state constitution allowing the legislature to fix miners' hours, no effective 8-hour law emerged till 1911.52. Montana, which passed an 8-hour law for miners and smelters in 1901 after narrowly failing to do so a decade before, resembled Utah in that legislation resulted from cooperation between unions and a mine-owning politician. Like Utah, it also produced a law that was enforced, if tardily and unevenly. Arizona, whose 1903 territorial statute applied only to mines, made no effort to prosecute under the law and used the Arizona Rangers to attack 8-hour strikers at Morenci. A Nevada law survived some constitutional tests but not others, while a 1901 Missouri statute covering underground miners remained unenforced until it passed a 1904 court test. By 1911, with California having entered the 8-hour ranks, hard rock mining generally operated, by law, on that schedule. But the battle had been long and disillusioning. As a recent study observes, for many miners, the struggle over the 8-hour day in the century's opening years first eroded and then destroyed the links of trust and support which bound them to their government. 53. The most significant Supreme Court defeat for labor came in a case involving New York bakers. After over a decade of trying to remedy their long hours, up to 16 and even 18 daily, through strikes, boycotts, and legislation, the Bakers' Progressive Union secured passage of a 10-hour law for bakers. 54 The campaign leading to passage of the law, brilliantly led by Henry Weissman, stressed both the damage to health done by laboring in hot shops and the public's interest in bread baked by healthy workers. The law was poorly enforced. In 1897, only 312 of 855 baking establishments investigated by factory inspectors complied with the 10-hour provision. However, by 1899 many unionized bakers secured the 10-hour system. Master bakers, heartened by the defection of Weissman to their ranks and by the decisions of California courts that hours laws for bakers there were unconstitutional, began an offensive against the 10-hour standard by backing Joseph Lochner, a non-union bakery owner in Utica, who refused to comply with the 1895 law. After the state Supreme Court found in favor of Lochner's employees in 1904, the Master Bakers Association appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The High Court, split 5-4, rejected the argument that wholesome bread could best be produced by setting hours. More importantly, it held that regulation of hours in the absence of a clear health hazard violated the rights of liberty and property guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. 55 This devastating decision, along with those discussed above and below in connection with women's labor, helped to rivet the AFL to a policy accentuating trade union action to gain the 8-hour day. After Haymarket, the AFL took 2 years to regroup before returning to an aggressive policy of using strikes and threats of strikes to reduce hours. Local hours strikes did occur during this period, especially in New York City, where an 1888 dispute involved 15,000 garment workers. 56 But it was the December 1888 AFL convention in St. Louis that renewed national agitation. That convention targeted May 1, 1890, as the date on which organized labor would enforce the 8-hour day. The resolution left open the possibility of a mass strike and inaugurated an energetic educational and organizational campaign around the issue. 4 holidays: Washington's birthday in 1889 and 1890, Labor Day in 1889, and July 4, 1889, were set aside for 8-hour rallies. Local 8-hour leagues, quite different from the craft-dominated structures usually associated with the AFL, emerged. Tens of thousands of 8-hour pamphlets went out. About 1,000 meetings, with speakers like Gompers, McNeil, and Henry George, took place in hundreds of cities. Gompers, who at the time encouraged industrial federations in the AFL, saw the 8-hour demand as the key organizing tool of the labor movement, as an issue which will wake up the millions of workers from their present lethargy. 57 The AFL president sent a message to the Paris Congress of Socialist and Labor Movements in 1889 proposing, as he later recalled, that May 1st be celebrated as an International Labor Day, and successfully urging solidarity with the planned 8-hour demonstrations in the United States. The original of that letter has never been found, but certainly a series of AFL actions, from Haymarket through 1890, were instrumental in the adoption of May Day as an international workers' holiday. 58 The 8-hour campaign not only enabled the AFL to make positive organizational moves on its own behalf, but won workers away from the Knights of Labor, whose leadership continued to oppose action on the issue. Powderly, speaking for the Knights, attempted to discredit the AFL strategy as a reckless repeat of 1886, but Gompers fended off criticisms by denying that a general strike loomed. In the present condition of labor, he wrote, no movement for a general strike would have my support. The end of the labor movement will not come in 1890, 59. At the 1889 AFL convention, delegates made clear that they were not threatening a general strike by voting to follow Gompers' suggestion that 1 or 2 trades be selected, upon which to concentrate the whole efforts of organized labor to secure the 8-hour workday. May 1, 1890. Gompers added that inauguration of the 8-hour system without strikes remained possible. This initial decision to pursue the 8-hour demand on a craft-by-craft basis did not coincide with a complete turn to craft conservatism by the AFL, though it did reflect distrust of the mass strike as a tactic. Indeed, the convention adopted a series of progressive measures, including a decision to fund and distribute an international 8-hour journal. Gompers, in his presidential address, held that the 1886 actions had achieved much and stressed that the movement united skilled and unskilled workers. 60 After polling the various member unions, the AFL Executive Council chose the carpenters to carry the 8-hour banner in 1890, to be followed by the miners in a subsequent year. Internationalism and cross-craft solidarity characterized the May 1st movement. The large strike fund of the carpenters and joiners union received additional funds from an AFL assessment of other unions. Union after union resolved to aid the carpenters with cash and to march in May 1st demonstrations. Despite refusal of cooperation by the Knights, 46,000 building tradesmen gained the 8-hour day and 30,000 won 9 hours, largely without long strikes. Indeed, the New York Times found the 1st of May, a quiet day throughout the country, as master builders acceded to their employees' demands. 61. The day was hardly quiet in terms of jubilant labor demonstrations. In many cities, the AFL joined the Socialist Labor Party in sponsoring rallies. In Chicago, 30,000 members, and in New York City, members of 70 unions turned out, bearing banners with such slogans as, "No more bosses," "Wage slavery must go," and "The 8-hour day is the next step in the labor movement." The New York demonstration pointed with pride to concurrent rallies in such nations as Australia, Austria, Belgium, Chile, Cuba, Denmark, England, France, Germany, Holland, Hungary, Italy, Peru, and Switzerland, and looked forward to the reorganization of society on a socialist basis. 62. For Gompers, the victories and the demonstrations of 250,000 English workers signified the universality of our movement, a ray of hope for the attainment of the poet's dream, the parliament of men, the federation of the world. 63. Such gains were never repeated. After 1890, the AFL did not attempt central IZED direction of another large 8-hour campaign. Most studies narrowly see this decline in emphasis on the working day as the result of the poor choice of the miners as the trade to succeed the carpenters in pressing the issue. The miners, with only one worker in 10 unionized and largely led by John Ray, who sympathized with the Knights and favored wide local autonomy, became embroiled in a costly 1891 strike, partly contesting for the 8-hour day, in the Connellsville, Pennsylvania, Coke area. The Union had to default on its commitment to mount a May 1891 campaign for 8 hours. 64. Disillusioned, the 1891 AFL convention turned down applications by the International Typographical Union and the Journeyman Bakers and Confectionaires National Union to lead the shorter hours movement next. 65. But the choice of the miners, however unfortunate, need not have stifled 8-hour enthusiasm. It is true that the miners' failure left bitterness among AFL delegates, especially Gompers, who regarded it an instance of Knights of Labor duplicity and contended that the miners' union acted precipitously and improperly in unilaterally calling off the wider 8-hour effort. But the action did not end 8-hour campaigning. Building tradesmen extended their gains of the previous year in a concerted 1891 campaign. The following year, the AFL backed the New Orleans General Strike, a massive display of black-white unity forged largely around the issue of hours. The New Orleans walkout was successful in winning the 10-hour standard for the Triple Alliance of Teamsters, Scalesmen, and Packers. 66. The retreat of the AFL leadership from large-scale, nationally coordinated 8-hour campaigns stemmed mainly from the triumph, in the early 1890s, of craft consciousness and conservatism. The alliance of Gompers with those Fédération leaders pressing for craft autonomy produced a hesitancy to embrace a demand which hinged on cross-craft cooperation and on solidarity of skilled and unskilled, and which sparked unpredictable 8-hour leagues, sympathy strikes, and tramping strikes. The most significant action of the 1891 convention was not the rejection of the bakers' and printers' applications, but the decision to leave the 8-hour struggle to individual craft unions without central direction and mass publicity. Among the convention's resolutions was a plank pledging not to reveal which craft would strike for 8 hours until the time of the strike. Although justified with the rationale that no competent strategist in military science would so prejudice any plan of operations, this decision left our strategy in the hands of AFL executives and craft leaders. The struggles against social ISDS and populists inside the AFL made the radical aspects of the 8-hour demand seem a liability to conservative unionists. Thus, the 1891 AFL Convention resolved to rely for counsel, sympathy and support only upon those who are identified with the trade union cause, and to whom the success of the short-hour movement is a matter of honest and vital concern. 67. For the rest of the 1890s and for a time thereafter, AFL initiatives on hours sputtered. President John McBride of the AFL asked delegates to consider the feasibility of inaugurating a movement to establish the 8-hour workday in 1895, but no action eventuated. A year later, Gompers proposed May 1, 1898, as a date for either general or limited enforcement of the 8-hour system. Maud held on the 1890 plan. The 1898 campaign included meeting on holidays and issuing pamphlets, but the executive committee did not pick a union willing to strike, and the target date passed uneventfully. The National Granite Cutters Union did secure the 8-hour day through a coordinated campaign in 1900, but, as Marion Cahill observes, this came through the internal strength of the union, not the feeble solidarity efforts of the AFL. 68. By 1901, the AFL only recommended discussion and commendation of 8-hour efforts and, in 1904, Reacting to plans by the International Typographical Union to press for shorter hours, the Federation abdicated central direction by endorsing any 8-hour campaign inaugurated by a national union. The wave of shorter hours strikes during the active union organizing of the 1901 to 1904 period developed without the AFL's leadership. Even so, in 1901 one striker in 5 acted purely to lessen hours, and over 35% of all strikers had hours among the issues in their walkouts. Wage increases alone were at issue for less than 25% of 1901 strikers. In 1902 and 1903, a total of 588,200 strikers listed hours as a demand while 397,595 sought only higher wages. 0.69. Tom of the century hours strikes by miners, machinists, and printers illustrated how far the AFL had come from its positions of 1886 and 1890. Anthracite miners in the east and metal miners in the west agitated for the 8-hour day, a gain many miners of soft coal achieved despite company violence and attempts to introduce strikebreakers in 1898.70. The anthracite miners, concentrated in eastern Pennsylvania and represented by the UMW, asked for a reduction in hours from 10 to 8, among other demands. 90% of area miners joined a strike in September 1900. Largely through the intervention of the National Civic Federation, whose leaders fretted about electing a Republican president in that election year, the railway executives controlling the mines were persuaded to settle with a compromise package providing higher wages but not shorter hours. Mine owners reneged on the agreement almost immediately and continuous friction resulted in another walkout, involving 184,000 miners in May 1902. The celebrated anthracite strike of 1902 focused on union recognition and on the size of a projected wage increase, and also involved a demand for 8 hours. The conflict lasted into the fall of 1902 and witnessed numerous attempts by NCF leaders to bring UMW leader John P. Mitchell, along with rail and mine executives, to the conference table. Mitchell and Gompers entertained repeated overtures from the NCF to moderate the strikers' demands and prevented a sympathy strike in the bituminous coalfields. 0.71 with socialist strength in the coalfields growing rapidly, with even the Chicago Tribune turning against the hard line taken by George F. Baer and his management associates, and with the development of a movement to nationalize the mines, President Theodore Roosevelt intervened. In early October he persuaded Mitchell to induce the miners to return to work with the strike issues to be settled through arbitration by a presidential commission. 5 months later the arbitrators granted a 9-hour day and a wage increase but not union recognition. Throughout the conflict the union leadership minimized the hours demand and warned of threats from radicals, sharp contrasts to the policies of the early years of the AFL. 0.72. The stormy strikes of non-ferrous metal miners in the West at the beginning of the 20th century, strikes which Philip Taft and Selig Perlman have called class war on a grand scale, usually revolved around the 8-hour issue. Those Colorado disputes at Telluride, 1901, Cripple Creek, 1903, Idaho Springs, 1903, and at American Smelting and Refining Company in Denver, like earlier ones at Leadville, 1880, and Cripple Creek, 1894, centered on the hours of labor, as did another in South Dakota in 1907.73. These struggles are best considered as part of the development of Western radicalism and industrial unionism and will be briefly discussed in a later chapter. It is worth noting here that the Western Federation of Miners, WFM, unaffiliated with the AFL after 1900, led these offensives, and that the AFL made few attempts to support 8-hour strikes in the West, making only tardy efforts to oppose repression against the Unionists and peppering those efforts with reiterations of employers' charges that the WFM was irresponsible and violent. Most seriously, in the case of the Ple Creek strike, the AFL-affiliated UMW called off a strike in the northern Colorado mines, enabling troops and mine police to concentrate an often fatal campaign of terror on miners to the south. The nadir of this retreat from solidarity came when UMW head John Mitchell reportedly asked Colorado's governor to order the great organizer Mary Mother Jones to leave the state, after Jones opposed abandonment of the strike. 0.74. AFL support for the International Association of Machinists, IAM, drive for a shorter working day in 1901 was influenced by Gompers's passion for arbitration and misplaced faith in the NCF. The IAM grew rapidly from 1898 to 1900, increasing its membership fourfold to 60,000. In 1900 the National Union demanded the 9-hour day in 5 major cities. As a result of the Murray Hill Agreement between the Union and the National Metal Trades Association, NMTA, in the spring of 1900, the 57-hour week was to be established nationally in 6 months, to be succeeded by a 54-hour week 6 months later. 0.75 Both Gompers and IAM President James O'Connell showed enthusiasm for the pact, as did NCF leaders, but when the May 10, 1901, deadline for beginning the 54-hour schedule came, so did trouble. Especially in St. Louis, Workers argued that their wages should not fall as a result of the change in hours. When IAM and AFL leaders asked the NMTA to reopen negotiations on the issue, the Employers Association refused, counseled local adjustments, and warned shop owners to prepare for strikes on May 20. The 58,000 strikers achieved some local successes, but usually not on the hours issue, and the NMTA, formerly at the head of labor management détente, became an outspoken advocate of an open shop and a bitter foe of shorter hours. 76. In the printing trades, the International Typographical Union, ITU, after a dozen years of agitation, had reached a 9-hour agreement, which also COV-ed unionized pressmen and bookbinders, with the United Typothete Employers Association in 1899. 3 days later, the ITU began a campaign to extend its gains to the 8-hour day. The National Union appointed an 8-hour committee and advised locals to seek a 15-minute reduction in the working day for the next 4 years. The 1903 convention set January 1, 1905, as the date to achieve a transition to 8 hours. In 1904, that date was moved back by a year and a hefty assessment for a strike fund was approved. 77. In anticipation of a battle over the 8-hour days scheduled by the ITU for the following January, the large Chicago printing firm, R. Donnelley, brought in non-union employees to provoke a strike in August 1905. Similar provocations took place in San Antonio, forcing the ITU to call for immediate, unified action to enforce the 8-hour system. During the 2-year campaign that followed, the union collected a 10% assessment on its working members to bolster a strike fund for those still fighting for the shorter day. Ultimately, the fund paid out $3.5 million in benefits. In Cleveland, 600 printers marched in the 1905 Labor Day parade bearing shining white umbrellas emblazoned with the ITU symbol and the words, 8 hours. By 1907, the 48-hour week was a reality in large unionized shops almost everywhere except Nashville and Kansas City. However, many formerly unionized employers instituted the open shop during the strike. In 1910, the ITU was still trying to reclaim workplaces, including the giant R. Donnelley in Chicago. Other employers agreed to the 48-hour week but, observing a half-holiday on Saturday, retained shifts of closer to 9 hours on weekdays. The AFL levied only a penny per week assessment, and that for just a month, to support the printers' 8-hour strikes, justifying Marion Cahill's view that the parent body did not take an active part in the struggle. 78. In printing as in other trades, the AFL no longer led and extended, but instead limited and channeled, shorter hours campaigns. In the realm of struggles to limit the hours of women's labor, the Federation would have an equally conservative impact. The female component of the labor force significantly increased between 1880 and 1900. The figure of 2,647,000 employed women of 1880 became 4,005,500 a decade later and 5,319,500 at the turn of the century. In 1880, 15.2% of all employed persons were female. In 1900, just over 18%. The presence of so many adult and child female workers attracted the sympathies of factory inspectors, middle-class reformers, and, at times, of the AFL leadership. Nonetheless, from 1895 through 1908, the number of women belonging to unions in New York, the largest and most unionized state, grew by only 596 while the number of organized men grew by 191,632. The tiny female proportion of the labor movement declined from 5.6% to a mere 2.9%. In Missouri, the other state for which reliable figures exist, between 1902 and 1908 the ranks of unionized women declined from 2,835 to 2,159. And their percentage edged downward from 3.6% to 2.8%. The figures from Chicago are more dismal. In 1903, an estimated 31,400 women belonged to all-female unions alone in Chicago. By 1909, the Women's Trade Union League found only about 10,000 Chicago women in unions of any kind. 80. Although employer opposition, especially in small clothing manufacturing shops, accounted for part of the failure to organize women, a large share of the blame belongs with the AFL leadership. Edward O'Donnell's American Federationist article of 1897 summarized the feelings of many craft union heads in its title, Women as Breadwinners, the Error of the Age. O'Donnell spoke of an invasion of the crafts by women, an evolutionary backslide, and an insidious assault upon the home, while contending that women were simply being used to undermine wage scales of skilled male workers. 81 An 1898 resolution urging the confining of women to the homes received serious consideration at the AFL's National Convention. Samuel Gompers himself, after earlier taking less sexist positions, echoed O'Donnell's rhetoric in 1905 articles for both the labor and popular press. Such a stance, combined with the fact that many working women were blacks and immigrants, made the AFL chronically unwilling to invest organizers and money in order to enlist women members. From the 1880s until after World War I, as Meredith Tax writes, efforts to organize women came less from the mainstream of the labor movement than from a series of united front efforts by socialists and feminists. 82. AFL indifference to organizing women had a damaging impact on the entire 8-hour movement. Working women of the period were not just organizable. They were the best constituency for struggle over the working day. Over half of all women workers labored in either the making or washing of cloth or clothing, or in domestic service. Hours, long an explosive issue in the textile and needle trades, continued to be a grievance, especially among garment workers whose seasonal unionism often produced ephemeral organization, strikes over long hours, and settlements which were not honored even months after the conflicts. From the strikes of Jewish sewing tradespersons in New York City in 1888, to the use of Mary Stuart's shorter hours jingle as a motto for the Chicago cloak makers union in 1896, to the 55-hour week campaigns of cap and hat makers in several cities after 1903, needle trades unionism emphasized hours as a cure for seasonal unemployment and featured an ebb and flow of gains and losses on the issue. 83 in domestic service and in many laundries the absence of any set hours made the working day a central issue. Service workers usually expressed their dissatisfaction by looking for another job, but some joined with reform groups or radical unions promising a shorter day. 84. Moreover, the double burden of employed women, working at home and on the job, made leisure particularly prized. Echoing a folk saying, socialist feminist Teresa Malkiel observed in 1908 that keeping a home was itself a full-time job and more, she, the housewife, works the longest hours and gets the lowest remuneration. The average tailor's work is done when the sun is down, but the housewife's work is never done. Recent research suggests that housework may have been more time-consuming in gritty early 20th century America than at any other time. When combined with a long shift of wage labor, housework left virtually no time for recreation and as little as 4.5 hours for sleep. 85 The observations of union organizer Alice Henry suggest something of the insensitivity of AFL officials and of the tight schedules of working women. The girls may prefer that the meeting should begin shortly after closing time so that they do not need to go home and return, or have to loiter about for 2 or 3 hours. They like meetings to be over early. The men mostly name 8 o'clock as the time of beginning, but business will not start much before 9. Working women and factory inspectors agree that women work many more hours every day than men. 10 hours a day to at least 1/3 of the working women means often 15. As late as 1920, the Retail Clerks Journal complained that women workers were mysteriously and unreasonably ready to shelve wage demands in order to gain the enjoyment of more leisure hours. 86. In addition to sharpening the focus of employed females on the length of the working day by placing such a premium on time, the combination of house and wage work may also have caused women to be sensitive to the deadening aspects of capitalist labor discipline. The findings of Herbert Gutman and others regarding resistance to industrial rules regarding time and work by peasant immigrants, rural people, and artisans reared in pre-industrial cultures apply, of course, to many immigrant women workers. They may also apply in a different way to all working women who share in housework, a variety of labor neither paced by the clock nor supervised closely. Respites on the job, even if only for minutes, were cherished by women workers. Mary Kenney, a Chicago bookbinder and activist in the Illinois Women's Alliance, received adulation from other women workers when she simply began to take 10-minute breaks twice a day. At the glovemaking shop where young Agnes Nestor, later president of the Chicago Women's Trade Union League, worked early in her career, women sang on the job and all chipped in and bought a $1 alarm clock to hang on the wall in order to make high piece rates and still find time each hour to turn off machines and talk. 87. Women cared more about time than the AFL cared about women, but the point runs deeper than that. As Meredith Tax has pointed out, the organizations pressing for bettering conditions for working women are best understood as united fronts, in which women of various classes and ideologies, workers, professional reformers, middle and upper-class feminists, cooperated on issues. In such alliances, the class participating most vigorously and contributing the clearest analysis tends to shape the behavior and ideas of the entire group. Tax maintains that after an early period in the late 1880s and 1890s when socialist and working women were hegemonic inside important women's organizations, a middle-class ideology based on charity, voluntary reform, consumerism, efficiency, and protection of women became dominant in subsequent years. This analysis applies well where hours are concerned and suggests that the AFL's backwardness helped to open the way for conservative, classless, and even sexist justifications by reformers for limiting the hours of work for women. 88 The history of the Illinois Women's Alliance, IWA, of the early years of Women's Trade Union League, WTUL, and of the National Consumers League, NCL, illustrates the promise and perils of a feminist labor alliance and illuminates the impact of AFL in action. It is hard to imagine a more varied and talented group of women than those who contributed to the growth of the IWA and the passage of Illinois' Preco-CS 1893 8-hour law for women. Since 1878, when the Working Women's Union was organized by women socialists, the city had had a tradition of labor activity by females. The Union, led by Lucy Parsons, by Alzina Stevens, a Lowell girl turned printer and member of Chicago Typographical Union No. 16. By Lizzie Swank, a cloakmaker, and by Elizabeth Rogers, a housewife, mother of 11, socialist, and officer of the Irish National Land League of America, defended women's suffrage as a socialist demand and pressed for a shorter day, contributing an impressive pink float to the 1879 Chicago 8-hour League Parade. In 1881, the Knights of Labor chartered the Working Women's Union as Labor Local Assemblies 1789. On the eve of the fateful May 3, when police shot down the 8-hour demonstrators at the McCormick Works, Knights organizers Lucy Parsons and Lizzie Swank led over 300 sewing women in a march for the shorter day. The Chicago Tribune, which branded the demonstrators shouting Amazons, reported that they tramped from shop to shop augmenting their ranks. But the Haymarket events rended the women's labor movement and Local 1789 quickly disbanded. 89. Among the women organizers who endured was Elizabeth Morgan, for a time the master workman of Local 1789. Morgan, the wife of the machinist and Socialist Labor Party leader Thomas Morgan, joined Swank and a group of Chicagoans to organize Lada's Federal Labor Union No. 2703 in June 1888 and secured its charter from the AFL. Like other federal unions in the adventurous early days of the AFL, No. 2703 contained a variety of workers: clerks, candymakers, typists, dressmakers, music teachers, bookbinders, gum makers, housewives, and others. Within 4 years, Local 2703 had built unions in 23 crafts and had become the leading organization of AFL-affiliated female workers. The best of the Local's organizers, Mary Kinney, described herself as a tramp bookbinder, going from shop to shop to organize the trade. Her organizing efforts focused on hours and, in at least one instance, Kinney enlisted both male and female binders by contrasting their 10-hour day with the 8-hour shift of unionized building tradesmen. 90. Local 2703 quickly delivered on its stated promise to build ties with the great labor organizations of this city, and to secure the active assistance of many women's organizations, in order to study and combat the moral, physical and mental degradation of women and children employed. In late summer of 1888, the Chicago Times published a sensational series of reports on city slave girls, which stressed long hours, low wages, child labor, and abysmal conditions, mainly in the needle trades. The Federal Union appointed an investigating committee, which confirmed the Times accounts and won the approval of the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly for a reform plan that included the enforcement of factory inspection and compulsory education laws by women inspectors, responsible to women's organizations, drawing on ties nurtured by the local support of women's suffrage, a position shared by Gompers and the AFL. More. Gahn called a meeting of women's groups. The October 6, 1888, gathering marked the beginning of the IWA, in which over 30 reform groups, most of them bourgeois, united at the behest of the women trade unionists and embraced the program for factory reform approved by Local 2703 in the Trades and Labor Assembly. Suffragists, single taxers, homeopaths, missionaries, and advocates of kindergartens joined members of ethical societies, temperance groups, religious orders, medical associations, literary circles, metaphysical clubs, and charities to press for factory inspection, compulsory schooling, sanitary regulations, and an end to harassment of women by policemen enforcing anti-vice laws. 91. The sometimes sentimental propaganda of the IWA and the famous memoirs of Jane Addams lend superficial credence to the criticisms of Lizzie Swank, who withdrew from the alliance, regarding it as hydra-headed, mild-mannered, and reformist. Indeed, the discussion of women's labor in conjunction with child labor did imply that working women required protection, and alliance literature did hold that immoral employers, not the class system itself, bred oppression. And criticisms of unsanitary workplaces were couched as a defense against conditions destructive to womanly purity, and inimical to motherly virtues. But Local 2703, which initiated the alliance, stated that the protection sought for working women was self-protection. Moreover, the emphasis on purity need not have derived from middle-class moralism. Women workers of the period, and some male unionists, emphasized the need to protect females from sexual harassment and to fight against prostitution, evils they saw as rooted in the class system. 92. In practice, the alliance brought a class perspective to its work, particularly on hours, and acted creatively to make demands on government and to build institutions of independent female and working class power. The campaigns against female and child labor and for compulsory education rested explicitly on the idea that the whole sweating system of clothing production, based on the labor of young people and powerless women working seasonally in decentralized and arbitrarily run open shops, had to be dismantled. After succeeding in 1889 in causing the Illinois legislature to pass a strong Compulsory Education Act, the alliance attacked long hours by demanding enforcement of an 1881 Chicago ordinance specifying an 8-hour maximum working day for children under 15. The IWA followed the lead of the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly in arguing that school inspectors ought to be non-salaried volunteers who could thus remain outside the city's machine politics. Where no inspection agencies existed, or where appointments proved unsatisfactory, the alliance set up agencies of its own using the labor of women volunteers. 93. The lobbying and statistical skills developed during the child labor fight soon found application in the investigation of conditions, particularly hours, of adult women. Labor Initiative began the campaign. Abraham Bisno, socialist head of the Cloakmakers Union, delivered an indictment of sweatshop labor before the Trades and Labor Assembly in August 1891. The assembly set up a committee, consisting of Morgan and 2 women from Hull House, to elaborate on Bisno's charges, and the 3 lead reporters, the city attorney, and a health department official through Chicago's underside, where 14-hour days were not uncommon. Morgan's findings, printed in The New Slavery, underscored the degradation of labor, and also played on middle-class fears of disease contagion through infected garments. After the Trades Assembly distributed 10,000 of her pamphlets, Morgan brought the issue before the Women's Alliance. Leisured women faced the human cost of their clothing and worried about the germs thereon. According to Bisno, health arguments proved best in enforcing the economic motive of the Unionists. 94. Although Jane Addams later disavowed any radicalism on the part of those lobbying for passage of an 8-hour law for women, Florence Kelley, the Hull House resident most instrumental in pressing for the legislation, wrote to Friedrich Engels at the time of the campaign that her goal was nothing short of a systematic endeavor to clear out the sweating dens. A Marxist, Kelley viewed her role as a labor investigator in strict class terms. The factory inspector of today, like the militiaman, is the child of the struggle of labor against capital. The factory inspector enforces the law for the worker against the capitalist. The militiaman shoots down the worker by command of the capitalist. 95. Kelley moved to Chicago in January 1892 partly in order to obtain a divorce. She immediately urged the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics to undertake an investigation of Chicago sweatshops and agreed to supervise the project. By November 1892, Kelley, herself working 12-hour days as an investigator, had completed a report on 800 shops and had joined Elizabeth Morgan in guiding U.S. Congressman Sherman Hoare on well-publicized tours of the establishments. After the 1892 election of populist Democratic Governor John Peter Altgeld, Illinois legislators appointed another committee to probe sweatshops and, with Kelley and Morgan assisting, the committee proposed legal reforms. 96. The resulting legislation, the Factory and Workshop Inspection Act, was, even given the agitation preceding it, a bolt from the blue. It introduced into Illinois industry provisions banning child labor in manufacturing, empowering the Board of Health to seize goods from unclean shops, requiring physician certificates for young workers between 14 and 16, and, most controversially, limiting the hours of work for women to 8. Support for the law came mainly from the Trades Assembly, the IWA, Hull House, and the General Federation of Women's Clubs, whose president, the wealthy Ellen Henroden, became a fixture in Chicago labor reform movements for decades. Those testifying for the bill ranged in their arguments from the Rev. V. P. Gifford, who held that the men should make the money and the women remain at home, to the populist radical Henry Demarest Lloyd, who broached the subject of nationalizing the industry. The bill passed in June 1893 with surprisingly little opposition. Altgeld appointed a dozen investigators, headed by Kelly and including Bisno, Alzina, Stevens, and Mary Kenny. Manufacturers counterattacked, despite less than vigorous early efforts of prosecutors to try the cases involving violations of the law. 97. The Manufacturers Protective Association wished to end all prosecutions under the 8-hour clause. After assessing contributions from its membership, it initiated suits to render the clause inoperative, asking that the factory inspectors not bring suits until the Illinois Supreme Court decided the constitutionality of the issue in a test case. The association met with a rebuff from Kelly and her cohorts, who successfully pressed prosecution in 13 consecutive cases. Kelly, writing to Engels, pointed with pride to the use of the law against stockyard magnates, who, having been arrested until they are tired of it, instituted the 8-hour day for 10,000 employees, men, women, and children. 98. But in the same December 31, 1894, letter to Engels, Kelly worried that the SC may annul the law. 10 weeks later, the Illinois Supreme Court did just that in accepting the Manufacturers Association's argument in the landmark case of P.F. C. Ritchie v. Illinois. Ritchie, a paperbox manufacturer arraigned for violating the 8-hour clause, maintained that the law was unconstitutional. The court agreed, holding not only that gender was an insufficient reason to limit hours but that the legislature absolutely had no right to infringe on freedom of contract by setting maximum hours for either sex. The far-reaching language of the court emphasized, as Kelly put it, that, this is not a question between the day of 8 hours and the day of 10, but between an unlimited working day and one restricted by statute. Kelly reported that, in the wake of the decision, some 14-year-old women worked shifts of 20 hours and that, 2 of the best literature classes, at Hull House, were broken up because the girls who composed them were obliged to resume working at the electric works until 9 o'clock at night. 99. The battle over enforcement of the 8-hour clause split the IWA. Its labor wing, formerly able to command a sure majority on such important issues as strike support, the use of organization and pressure rather than charity as reform strategies, and support for the passage of the Inspection Act, failed in February 1894 to pass a resolution, strongly condemning the manufacturers of this city for combining to nullify the state laws. Though the alliance reversed itself at the next meeting, some of its members and at least one of its officers had developed ties to the Manufacturers Association. The alliance did sponsor a meeting, attended by 1,000 people, to debate the bill. Morgan, Henry Demarest, Lloyd, and Ellen Henroden represented the alliance's position of support for the law. The Manufacturers Association, which had first requested an opportunity to present its case, declined to attend. The very fact that the 8-hour clause had become an object for debate showed the tensions in the alliance. By October 1894, the latest federal labor union had withdrawn from the dying IWA to form its own women's labor organization, a weak group that admitted no bourgeois women, rejecting even Henroden. 100. Obviously, a coalition like the IWA ran constant risks of internal discord between working-class and middle-class women. But it is misleading to see its demise as resulting simply from the maturation of such conflict around the 8-hour issue. Throughout the life of the alliance, labor women had confidently fought for their politics amidst opposition. That they withdrew suddenly in 1894, without ever losing on a major issue inside the alliance, reflects a loss of unity and confidence by the working women. Not only did the women unionists face splits over division between socialism and Gomperism during this period, but they also faced the failure of the AFL to support women's organizing. In 1892, Gompers appointed Mary Kenny as the first paid national AFL organizer of women. Kenny based her activities in Chicago, organizing unions of shoe workers, bookbinders, hack drivers, retail clerks, and garment workers there. In the garment trades, a series of strikes resulted in the 10-hour day at many shops, and the cloakmakers union gained its first important membership among women. But after just 6 months, the AFL Executive Council, over Gompers's objection in this case, withdrew Kenny's funds, finding the expense of organizing women was not worthwhile. With the Depression of 1893, unionism in the needle trades collapsed. The very time of the early enforcement of the Inspection Act, when unionism was expected to boom, became a period of defeat for labor organizations. In this context, labor women retreated from the labor feminist coalition and the IWA dissolved. Building on the work of the Alliance and that of early women labor organizers, Chicago females built the strongest women's labor movement in the nation, organizing 35,000 women workers by 1903 and mobilizing thousands of female clerks in support of early closing. 101 But no united front dominated by working-class women re-emerged. The next united front experiment, the organization of the women's trade. Union League, WTUL, began in 1903 when both the National WTUL and the New York WTUL took shape. That year Mother Jones stirred the consciences of women and men throughout the nation by leading a celebrated March of the Mill Children along the East Coast in support of child labor laws and of a fruitless shorter hours strike by 75,000 Philadelphia area textile workers. Since from 10,000 to 16,000 of the strikers were children and most of them female, Jones's march lent urgency to the issues raised by the WTUL. Many familiar names joined the new organization: social workers like Adams and Kelly, organizers like Mary Kinney, now Mary Kinney O'Sullivan, and the wealthy Allies. Mary Dreyer, Margaret Dreyer Robbins, and Ellen Henroden. New faces included the Chicago settlement houseworker Mary McDowell, organizers Agnes Nestor, Rose Schneiderman, Mary Anderson, Melinda Scott, Elizabeth Maloney, Emma Stevenson, and garment worker Lenora O'Reilly. The WTUL structured itself as a conscious coalition of leisured allies and workers, in which the majority shall be women who are, or have been, trade unionists. The minority of those well known to be earnest sympathizers. 102. The cooperation was fraught with tension. In theory, the elite component was to educate working women to lead their own struggles, but until 1907 Allies dominated the membership rolls, and even afterwards their greater resources and leisure made the wealthy disproportionately influential in the League. Lenora O'Reilly's complaint, before her temporary resignation in 1905, that allies must drop the attitude of the lady with something to give her sister, typified the suspicion of upper-class reformers by working-class members. But a network of friendships, a consciousness of sisterhood, and a general support for the AFL approach to organizing strategy united the WTUL. 103. The WTUL, from its founding convention in 1903, supported the 8-hour day. Its anthem, written by the socialist feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman, proclaimed, "For the right pay for us, we stand as one. For the short day for us, stand as one." Its logo, dating from 1903, linked 8 hours and defense of the home. Margaret Robbins, longtime WTUL president, advocated a shorter working day during her employment as a Chicago settlement houseworker and during her tenure as head of the League. Robbins's efforts helped make the Illinois WTUL exception ally active in legislative campaigns for a 10-hour day for women, campaigns which resulted in passage of such a state law in 1909.104. But the WTUL failed, in its early years, to contribute much to the cutting of the working day. Taking the AFL as its model, it regarded organization rather than legislation as its central activity and generally saw the two as counterposed. Although somewhat active in campaigns to restrict the hours of children, the WTUL generally left the dominant role in the legislative movement to restrict women's hours to the National Consumers League. 105 Nor were the early WTUL organizing efforts successful at reducing hours. Although the AFL maintained cordial relations with the WTUL and the organizations usually held national conventions at a common site and time, the Executive Council suspected WTUL feminism and socialism, refused to commit funds and to appoint women organizers, and sometimes urged the union label rather than organizing as a panacea. International unions failed to follow up on organizational efforts by the WTUL, so that gains in limiting the working day were often reversed only months after they occurred. Adherence to AFL practice meant that the WTUL attempted, inappropriately, to set up craft unions, even in industries like garment manufacture. Thus, the WTUL was, between 1903 and 1909, less an organizing force than a strike support group. Its allies backed largely spontaneous strikes, mainly over wages and especially over union recognition. Occasionally, as at the New York strike at a Broadway box-making factory in 1904, the WTUL intervened significantly in a strike over hours, but more often, as in the larger, successful San Francisco laundry workers' hours strike of 1907, no WTUL chapter functioned. 106 The New York chapter, with Chicago's chapter being the nation's most active, probably had only a few score active members in 1907. With the later mass strikes in the garment industry and with the 1909 WTUL resolution in favor of specific shorter hours legislation, the group had greater impact on the working day, but it did not challenge the National Consumers League, NCL, as the chief ideological force in the movement to protect women workers. 107. The NCL originated in New York City, largely out of contacts between Alice Woodbridge, a retail clerk, and Josephine Shaw Lowell, a Civil War widow who continued the reform spirit of her ancestors in a variety of charitable enterprises. Woodbridge, leader of the Working Women's Society, a small group founded in 1889, conducted an investigation of the clerking trade and produced an 1890 report with a list of grievances that led off with the complaint: "We find the hours are often excessive, and employees are not paid for overtime." Woodbridge's testimony so moved Lowell, the feminist physician Mary Putnam Jacoby, and Maud Nathan, a wealthy housewife, that it was decided to call a mass meeting on the subject. Woodbridge spoke before a large crowd, which included church leaders from the city. The meeting pledged support for a state 8-hour law for women and children, and resolved to appoint a committee to assist the Working Women's Society in preparing a list of shops which deal justly with their employees. That committee imitated a similar British reform group by taking the name Consumers' League. 108. The New York Consumers' League adopted the basic ideas and strategy that were to characterize the leagues in various states and nationally. Both Woodbridge and her bourgeois associates despaired of organizing young, female clerks and saw reform as coming about through legislation or voluntary compliance. Consumers, not workers, constituted the key to change and, organized, could ensure that working conditions shall be at least decent, according to Maud Nathan. Consumers were in a position to exercise power, greater than either labor, or capital. Florence Kelley, longtime president of the NCL, came to agree with Nathan and the AFL that women's power lay at home and in the market, more so than at work. Since the exodus of manufacture from the home, she wrote, the one great industrial function of women has been that of purchaser. The international motto of the consumers' leagues of various nations summed up the reform rationale. Vivre c'est équiter, c'est pouvoir, c'est devoir. 109. That is, to live means to buy means to have power means to have duties. The Consumers' League took a neutral stance on class issues and ultimately barred both employers and workers from membership. From the start, the New York League absolved owners of blame for abuses, declaring in 1891 that the majority of employers are virtually helpless to improve conditions as to hours and wages, unless sustained by public opinion, by law, and by the action of consumers. 110. Thereafter, as Nathan stressed, the League never sentimentally put the rights of the employee above the rights of the employer, only on occasions. Most notably the 1913 New York City Retail Clerks Organizing Drive did the League back unionization. 111. Such a class-neutral approach shaped League response to the length of the working day, an issue that it held to be central during the 2 decades after 1890. League literature vividly portrayed the demands placed on the time of retail clerks: long hours of constant standing, 20-minute lunches often delayed till 3 p.m., the absence of breaks, and the prevalence of forced overtime, especially during the holidays. The simplest League solution was to educate shoppers to shop only during a limited number of hours and to discontinue browsing, an activity which Nathan regarded as a crime. 2. A second strategy, instituted in New York in 1891, centered on the publication of a whitelist of stores approved as having established just conditions. The stipulations included an 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. working day, 45 minutes for lunch, a week's paid vacation during the summer, and pay for overtime. Of 1,400 stores surveyed, 8 qualified for the 1891 whitelist. The whitelist idea suffered from employer disinterest and the refusal of the press to publicize the list, but it continued to be a favorite League emphasis. Issuing of the consumer's label on garments, begun in 1898, reflected a similar voluntarism plus pressure approach. 3. The failure of voluntarism encouraged the NCL to participate in legislative efforts to shorten the working day for women. In 1890, the New York League supported AFL-sponsored legislation to extend the state's hours law for factory women to cover clerks. That effort failed, but 6 years later, League testimony before the State Senate's Commission on Female Labor contributed to the passage of the Mercantile Inspection Act, which set 60 hours as the maximum working week for women under 21 and boys under 16 in all commercial establishments in towns of 3,000 or more. 3 years later, League Pres sure helped secure a strengthening of the law. During the first decade of the 20th century, it was the League, more than the AFL, that fought against attempts to add loopholes and exemptions, especially for canneries, to hours legislation covering New York women. On the other hand, the League, having defined 10 hours as just, moved slowly toward support for the 9-hour day legislation advanced by the unions after 1901. The one area in which the League and the unions cooperated completely was the passage of 1907 legislation providing an 8-hour day for child laborers in New York. 4. As the Consumers' League movement spread to 90 local chapters and 20 state organizations, efforts to decrease women's hours through education, through use of the list and label, and through legislation proliferated. Leagues helped to pass or extend shorter hours legislation for women and/or children in a dozen states and the District of Columbia between 1898 and 1922. Landmark enactments for women included the 58-hour week law for Massachusetts women clerks, 1898, the 8-hour day law in the District of Columbia, 1916, the 9-hour day laws in Missouri, 1909, 1911, and 1913, Rhode Island, 1913, Pennsylvania, 1913, and New York, 1912, and the 10-hour stat. Utes in Kentucky, 1912, Delaware, 1913, Maryland, 1912, and Oregon, 1903. The last mentioned of these codes, which applied to women workers in factories and laundries, was most important because it generated a key legal victory for the constitutionality of laws limiting the working day for women in the case of Muller v. Oregon, 1907-1908, 5. Although Muller v. Oregon itself only involved the question of whether Oregon's 10-hour law would apply to laundresses working for Colt Muller, the case had significant ramifications. Louis D. Brandeis, the liberal lawyer invited onto the case by Josephine Goldmark, his sister-in-law, and by Florence Kelley, both of the NCL, represented the state of Oregon by presenting a brief that broke decisively from legal tradition. Citing barely 2 pages of legal arguments, and only a single precedent of courts upholding the constitutionality of restricting women's hours, Brandeis devoted scores of pages to material on the history and sociology of shorter hours. Using the wording of the court's decision in Lochner v. New York, 1905, Brandeis maintained that such evidence was relevant because it aided the court in determining whether a direct relation existed between the statute and the public good. When this novel line of argument was allowed, Brandeis won a victory that, as one biographer put it, changed the development of the legal profession and the path of the law, coming in the wake of Ritchie v. Illinois and Lochner v. New York, as well as the striking down of general 8-hour laws in Nebraska, 1894, Muller v. Oregon offered new hope for the enforcement of hours laws, even those that infringed upon the freedom of contract. 6. The importance of Muller v. Oregon and the innovation present in Brandeis's Oregon Brief have led many historians to regard the brief and the NCL, which researched and published it, as radical. 7. While the brief is a creative departure in terms of legal theory, its arguments were anything but leftist. Instead, they rested on a need to institute moderate reforms to forestall demands for more extreme measures, on perception of women as biologically inferior beings whose morals and capacity for motherhood needed protection, and on the view that greater efficiency and fewer hours would increase productivity and benefit employers. 8. In further briefs, especially that prepared by Goldmark for Brandeis in Ritchie v. Wayman, a 1910 Illinois case overturning the anti-labor Ritchie-Deci Scion of 1898, the themes of women's inferiority, women's place, and productivity became even more prominent. When, in 1912, the Russell Sage Foundation published Goldmark's researches on the working day, the book bore the title, Fatigue and Efficiency, and included homage to Taylorism, which Brandeis and Goldmark both embraced as an incentive to reduce hours. 9. Of course, it is idle to suggest that Brandeis could have won his case before the Supreme Court with attacks on sexism and class privilege. But in a slightly different context, the judicial arguments might have changed perceptibly. With a strong contingent of organized women supporting reform, the protection argument might have centered not on woman's biological disadvantages but on her double oppression as a wage worker and a homemaker, and on her subjection to sexual harassment. The contention that shorter hours contributed to the public good might have emphasized not Taylorist efficiency but the regulation of hours to ensure full employment. Outside the courts and legislatures, debates on shorter hours for working women might have included, as they did through much of the 19th century, discussions of surplus value and of whether employers ought to control the workplace absolutely. In such an environment, a stronger labor wing of the women's suffrage movement, seeking the vote specifically to implement labor reform, might have developed. AFL conservatism, in small and large ways, touched the whole 8-hour movement. Nine. Class conflict, reform, and war. The working day from 1907 to 1918. The years before, during, and just after World War I were, as David Montgomery has written, the decisive period in the battle for the 8-hour day. 1. From 1905 until 1920, the average working week of non-agricultural workers plummeted from 57.2 to 50.6 hours. In manufacturing, it dropped from 54.5 to 48.1, the rough equivalent of an 8-hour day, 6 days per week. In 1910, 8% of the nation's workers labored 48 hours or less per week. In 1919, 48.6% did. The proportion of workers laboring over 54 hours weekly declined from 70% to 26% during the same decade. Point 2. In the wake of World War I, hundreds of thousands of trade unionists gave favorable consideration to fighting for a working day of 6 hours or less. Point 3. This chapter describes the most productive period of shorter hours agitation in U.S. history. It also describes a period which again features many of the same characteristics of the movement for reduced hours that had become so well established in the 19th century. The coexistence of political and trade union campaigns for more leisure, the tendency for workers to unite across lines of sex, skill, and ethnicity in support of 8 hours, the meshing of workday demands with those calling for workers to have more control over their lives off, and especially on, the job. These features, which had somewhat declined in importance between 1891 and 1907, reappeared dramatically as battles for control on the job and for the right to leisure were joined. Two major hours changes of this period came from outside the labor movement. The granting of the 8-hour day by Henry Ford in 1914 and the federal government's seeming embrace of 8 hours, especially in the 1916 passage of the Adamson Act and in the War Industries Board's later approval of a basic 8-hour day. Indeed, the combination of an easing in corporate animosity to shorter hours and a desire to see to it that the privates' uniforms of the Army of the United States and other war goods are not made in sweatshops. Could provide an easy explanation for the progress in shortening the working day. Were Ford not such a maverick and the commitment of the government not so brief and shaky? Both Fordism and wartime labor policy deserve emphasis as genuine. 177. Innovations. But neither is understandable without sustained consideration of the deepening CIASS conflict surrounding the length of a hour. The commitment of trade unionists and unorganized worker to the 8-hour day more or less, in the years after 1907 came from several sources. Certainty. The proliferation of mass popular culture, in the form of silent movies, pro-phase cyonal and college sports, amusement parks, inexpensive fiction, and other pastimes made leisure more prized, but the notion that corporate capital shrewdly granted shorter hours, knowing that workers would be drawn into the wastelands of consumer culture, cannot withstand scrutiny. Point 1. Usually corporations fought shorter hours. Ford, the leading figure who did OOC, viewed mass culture with nearly paranoid suspicion. Moreover, the motivations of many advise the shorter hours struggles hinged on gaming time not to pursue empty diver science, but to participate in a variety of work. MGCIASS and ethnic Sutudicans. Point 1. Labor activism and self-education required time. William Z. Foster, a syndicalist active within the AFL during these years, barely recalled that prior to World War I his schedule as a railway worker entailed 12-hour days and thus barred him from amending most Chicago Federation of Labor meetings. It is obvious, wrote the socialist activist Mary Marcy, that men or women working from 10 to 16 hours daily will have little strength or leisure to study for revolutionary work. Stress on study was especially viral, since plus or minus his period saw a boom in workers' education, which, by early 1921, produced over 24 labor schools. Unions, the socialists, WW, and the anarchists all had schools. Colleges, including Bryn Mawr, Northwestern, and the Elemvareti of Chicago offered courses for unionists, often under the auspices of Wilt. In addition, many rank-and-file workers attended night schools to earn English and new skills. A remarkable intellectual he conduced many languages, graced the left and labor movements and the classics along with cheaply available left-wing pamphlets circulated among activists. One of the most popular works, Paul Lafargue's The Right to be Lazy, extolled proletarian leisure. A second factor making the hours demand prominent was pressure from groups outside plus or minus labor movement as SC often happened in the Team Century. Political reform and trade union strategies coexisted in the bathe for mere hours. Reform groups such as the NCL, UTUL, and American Askanson for labor legislation agitated for shorter hours laws, especially for women. In 1913, the UTUL in New York headed a strong movement for an 8-hour and contrast to the STARE, AFL, fought hard against exempting seasonal industries from the hours law. The WTUL also subvented strike ACNCCS aimed at mercer hours, especially the needle trades. In 1916, the WTUL neared a mid-Atlantic STARE's 8-hour conference, which favored RHE8HCUR day through collective bargaining as well as through ISUNN. IJ and Me Steel Industry reform group centered around Survey magazine taking a protracted track on the 12-hour day and the 7-day week. Form, on which Theodore Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency, included a plank proposing 8-hour laws covering children, women, and all workers in continuous production industries like the steel industry. The Socialist Party, SP, had special impact on the course of AFL strategy regarding the working day. SP platforms consistently pressed for the 8-hour day as did International Socialist Review and other socialist periodicals. Godfrey Ritterskamp's socialist indictment of the welfare system in Chicago and New York in 1914 proposed a more substantial cut in hours and links such a reduction to broader issues. What will help us now? Socialism, says somebody. Right. Let's take a step towards socialism. Begin with the 6-hour day. The 6-hour day will give work to every unemployed man and woman. It will fill every empty stomach. 12. Socialists generally proposed a legislative solution for the problem of long hours. It was on this score that they opposed the policy of AFL leadership. In 1914, the Socialists sponsored 8-hour initiatives in the November elections in Washington, Oregon, and California. Each failed, in the words of John R. Mons and John B. Andrews, largely through the opposition of the farmer vote. At the 1915 AFL convention, a socialist-led coalition challenged the position of the Gompers leadership, which held that only collective bargaining should be used to usher in the shorter day. Socialists and their allies held that tactics should be flexible. William Green, then an AFL vice president and head of the UMW, broke with Gompers on this score. Is there anyone here, he asked, who believes the man who enjoys the benefit of the 8-hour day through economic organization enjoys it more than the man who secured it through legislation? 13. John Fitzpatrick, head of the Chicago Federation of Labor, spoke for the 8-hour day by legislation, both industrially and politically, a position endorsed by the Illinois Federation of Labor. Gompers and his supporters, sure that political initiatives were a waste of effort, because the courts will knock it, an 8-hour law, out, held on to win a close vote on the issue, but labor bodies continued to back 8-hour laws in some states. 14. While the lures of mass and class leisure and the activities of reform and radical groups outside of the labor movement helped to focus attention on the hour's demand, changes in labor and in the unions themselves were more critical factors. What André Triden referred to in 1914 as the New Unionism swept the United States in the years surrounding World War I, producing not only strikes of unprecedented size, but also an upsurge of interest in workers' control and of cooperation among workers of various levels of skill and in diverse branches of industry. Underlying this labor dynamism was a collection of grievances affecting the skilled, the unskilled, and those between. The proliferation of managerial rationalizations and naked speed-ups undermined the traditional control over production that skilled workers had held by virtue of their expertise. Job structures featuring a multiplicity of categories of semi-skilled labor made craft distinctions obscure. Semi-skilled specialists faced unemployment during frequent recessions. Among the largely immigrant unskilled workers, speed-ups, layoffs, and low wages drew protest. As Montgomery observes, the new industrial discipline had promoted a sense of raw injustice among, as well as within, the ethnic communities. 15. Reacting to these grievances, it is not surprising that workers seized upon the issue of hours. The most systematic expression of early 20th century changes in management, Taylorism, forced those on the shop floor to focus on the clock. It undertook studies that subjected every activity on the job to timing by stopwatch. With informal kinds of workers' autonomy under siege, claiming of the right to limit one's hours of work became a fundamental assertion of control over conditions of employment. Gompers' 1914 position suggested how bound up was the issue of the working day with the issue of control on the job. It is not just a question of an 8-hour workday, a shorter workday, but the method our trade union movement is going to sanction that will be used to regulate and determine the conditions under which we are going to work. 16. With craft barriers eroding, the 8-hour demand also functioned to hold together movements containing a variety of workers. Amalgamation, federation, and industrial unionism, as well as cooperation among unions in strikes, hinged upon unity around a common issue. Most often, the 8-hour day, or union recognition, was that issue. As Debs observed, there is something in the shorter workday that appeals to every working man whether he belongs to a union or not, or whether he is class conscious or not, and it is this something which gives power to the movement that fights to realize it for the workers. 17. Those labor organizations that most strongly pressed for labor unity, that sought to organize the unorganized, that addressed the need to assert job control, that attempted to unionize mass production industries, that innovated in terms of organizational forms, and that included an ethnically, sexually, or racially diverse rank and file, brought the issue of the working day to the fore during the years before 1916. The most conscious advocates of the New Unionism, the industrial workers of the world, IWW, made the hours question central in their organizing, but this stance was not unique to the far left wing of the labor movement. Whether influenced by the IWW or not, unionism in the heavy mass production and extractive industries, and in the female and immigrant-dominated clothing and textile industries, stressed shortening the working day. The IWW persistently emphasized the shorter day. A group that projected a syndicalist vision of industry and society managed by workers could hardly have ignored the struggle to provide the spare time necessary for such democratic self-management. Moreover, in organizing the unskilled, the Wobblies, as IWW members were often called, faced the issue of unemployment constantly and held up shorter hours as a palliative, though not a solution. Since poorly paid members of its unskilled constituency could hardly afford pay cuts in conjunction with shorter hours, the IWW often raised pay demands along with reductions in hours. 18. Finally, the IWW's ancestry, especially its descent from the Western Federation of Miners, WFM, ensured that it would be sensitive to the 8-hour issue. In the 4 years before the IW's 1905 founding, the WFM led a series of 8-hour strikes among miners and smeltermen in Colorado. The strikes culminated in the bloody disputes at Cripple Creek and Telluride in 1903 and 1905 respectively. These two strikes claimed 42 dead, over 1,100 wounded, and 1,300 arrested before ending in defeat at Cripple Creek and victory at Telluride. From their inception, wobbly strikes, led by WFM veterans like Big Bill Haywood and Vincent Street John, adopted the same 8-hour goal. 19. IWW strikes, like those of the AFL during this period, often addressed the hours question in combination with other grievances. Thus most of the conflicts described below in this chapter involved the working day as one vital issue, but not as the only issue. In addition to striking for the shorter day in individual cases, the IWW attempted two major national agitational campaigns around the issue. At its founding convention, the group received a letter from the General Confederation of Labor in France, which promised, from May 1, 1906, forward, we will work only 8 hours a day. The U.S. group later set into motion similar campaigns with the IWW printing thousands of stickers reading, "I won't work more than 8 hours after May 1, 1912. How about you? 20. At its September 1911 convention, the IWW dropped the May 1, 1912, target date, but the campaign gave rise to a number of local 8-hour leagues, important in such major strikes as that at Paterson in 1913. In late 1913, wobbly attempts to organize the unemployed began to feature calls for a 6-hour day. Activists sometimes reverted to an 8-hour demand in unemployed organizing and in actual negotiations, as on the Philadelphia docks where an integrated IWW won shorter hours and job control. But the logic was the same. If those who are now working would take it easy and not work so many hours a day, there would be plenty of work for all. Later the IWW demand would be for the 4-hour day, jobs for everyone. 21. In the following description of pre-war and wartime shorter hours strikes, the IWW will loom large, more so than its size alone, always less than 200,000 and usually substantially less than 10% of all organized labor, would suggest. But equally remarkable was the record of many AFL unions in organizing semi-industrially, enrolling minorities, federating and amalgamating, in breaking craft barriers, to win reductions in the working day. During these years the shorter hours activities of the IWW and AFL, despite rancor between the two groups, were similar enough to deserve discussion together. 22. The pre-World War I years witnessed the most spectacular strike wave by women workers in U.S. history, with the walkouts centering in the textile and clothing industries. These uprisings, as they were termed at the time, have received attention from historians, but several themes regarding their connection with the movement for a shorter working day deserve emphasis. These themes include the tendency toward industrial unionism in response to speed-ups in production and to a long workday, the necessity of linking wage and hour demands in low-wage industries, the use of the shorter hours demand to combat unemployment, and the attempted unity, usually under socialist leadership, of men and women of various ethnic groups seeking a reduction in hours. Both the most famous IWW textile strikes, those at Lawrence and at Paterson, hinged on hours, though the former did so indirectly. The 1912 Lawrence strike followed the 1911 passage of a Massachusetts state law limiting the hours of women and children to 54 per week. In Lawrence, where about half the 30,000 textile workers were women and children, and where a third of all mill hands earned less than $7 for a week of 56 or more hours, laborers could not afford the reduction of pay that would accompany the reform. The celebrated demand for bread and roses, raised during the strike, bespoke a desire for leisure and for more pay, but the former issue dominated, since the reduction of hours had already come by law. A small IWW chapter led the 25,000 workers who walked off their jobs on January 13, after their first payday under the new law. The strikers, speaking 45 different languages, stayed out for 2 months before winning pay boosts of up to 25%. Lawrence set the crucial precedent that shorter hours need not lead to less wages among unskilled workers. Throughout 1912 the textile strike wave continued. By April 1, 275, 000 New England textile workers had gained higher pay as a result of the inspiration of Lawrence. 24. In the major textile strike in which the IWW directly addressed the issue of hours, the results were not so positive. That struggle, among Paterson, New Jersey, silk workers, saw unionists demand an abolition of the four-loom system, a $12 weekly minimum wage, and, for the first time in a major textile strike, 8 hours. As Bill Haywood wrote, the demands of the workers have crystallized around a determination to have the 8-hour day. Beginning in late January 1913, after agitation by an IWW 8-hour league, the Patterson struggle involved over 25,000 workers, mostly women and children. The strikers shut down America's silk capital for 4 months by successfully forging an alliance among immigrants, especially Russian Jews and Italians. Advised by Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and Carlo Tresca, the workers resisted employer appeals to that brand of Americanism, equating the national good with the open shop. 25. Why female workers, saddled with both housework and millwork, backed 8 hours as suggested by a telling incident related by Flynn in her accounts of Pater's son. Tresca made some remarks about shorter hours, people being less tired, having more time to spend together, and jokingly he said, more babies. The audience of tired working wives did not cheer this suggestion, no. Carlo, interrupted Haywood, we believe in birth control, a few babies, well cared for. The women started to laugh and applaud. 26. Ultimately, in the face of police violence, mass arrests, separate settlements with English-speaking workers, and want, the strike faltered. The defeat stopped the momentum of the IWW textile organizing drive. Efforts continued, most signify Cantley at Greenville, South Carolina, where Matilda Rabinowitz organized the first wobbly textile local in the South and led an unsuccessful strike for shorter hours. The tide, however, had turned. 27. In the needle trades, the IWW and independent AFL unions led a series of struggles around wages, union recognition, and a shorter working day in industries manufacturing both men's and women's clothing. These campaigns, marked by tremendous rank-and-file activity, were often limited by the conservatism of the AFL leadership and sometimes by the leadership of the clothing trades unions themselves. Still, they enjoyed at least one advantage over those of the IWW unions. They had the support of the WTUL and other feminist organizations, a support usually denied the IWW. In the earliest of the garment industry strikes, the 1909 uprising of the 20,000, in New York City, both pressure from the ranks and WTUL support were critical. The shirtwaist and dressmakers who participated in the strike, 80% of them young women, had the worst of both worlds. Their long hours, at least 56 to 59 per week and up to 13 daily, alternated with bouts of unemployment. Cuts in piece rates reduced their average weekly pay to $9 to $10 in 1909. Arbitrary work rules abounded, fines and dismissals enforced labor discipline. The fragmented labor force included 35,000 to 40,000 workers in 600 separate shops. Over 2/3 were Jewish immigrants, with native-born Americans, including several hundred Afro-Americans, and Italians making up most of the balance. Given these conditions, any attempt to organize had to focus on uniting workers around shorter hours at higher wages and on union recognition. But the male leadership of the tiny International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, Local 25, had little confidence in the ability of the women to organize, no matter what the demands. Influenced by Rose Schneiderman and other WTUL organizers, and by social ISDS from the United Hebrew Trades, the women workers mounted a series of shop-by-shop strikes in the early fall of 1909. On October 21, with 2,000 new members added to Local 25, a Cooper Union meeting convened to consider a general strike in the trade. After hearing Samuel Gompers speak guardedly about the possible necessity for such an action, the crowd listened to a rank-and-filer, a victim of a beating during one of the recent shop strikes. Young Clara Lemlich declared, I would not have further patience for talk, as I am one of those who feels and suffers from the things pictured. I move that we go on a general strike. The motion carried admissed cheers and the 3,000 in attendance then swore a Hebrew oath of loyalty to the strike. 28. Organizers hoped for 5,000 strikers, but got 18,000 or more on the first day. At its height, according to WTUL leader Helen Merritt, the uprising of the 20,000 inches may have had as many as 30,000 participants. It was, she wrote, a woman's strike, 80% were female. 9 strikers in 10 were Jewish, but some American-born women and 2,000 Italians also walked out. This solidarity produced speedy results, then protracted conflict. Many small shops agreed to Local 25's demands quickly, granting a 52-hour week, a union shop, changes in work rules, and arbitration of wage issues. But the largest clothing concerns vowed to stand together for the open shop. In the nearly 4 months of picketing that followed, hundreds of strikers and several WTUL allies suffered arrest. Women's suffrage groups such as the Political Equality League worked in cooperation with socialists to build early strike support demonstrations. When the strike spread to Philadelphia in late December, Bryn Mawr students and the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association rallied in support. On December 27, the larger employers proposed a settlement that granted most of the strike demands, but preserved the open shop. The strikers overwhelmingly rejected it. For a time, solidarity remained strong. A Carnegie Hall rally on January 2, in which wealthy members of what Schneiderman called the Mink Brigade played a prominent role, featured proposals for citywide sympathy strikes by all women workers. But support soon waned. AFL backing, measured in money and organizers, was meager. Middle-class allies became less supportive when the issue was purely union recognition. By February 1910, the strikers returned to work in open shops. But they did so with a 52-hour week, 52.5 in Philadelphia, and 4 paid holidays. 29 This pattern of granting concessions regarding hours while maintaining the open shop enabled some employers to sever the connection between a shorter working day and other union-inspired initiatives for control over work. The pattern would recur frequently, especially in packing and steel, over the next decade. Ultimately, the uprising of the 20,000 inches bettered the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. Strikes over hours raced through the clothing industry. In July 1910, 60,000 cloak and suit makers engaged in a general strike in New York City, demanding a 48-hour week, double pay for overtime, and recognition. This Great Revolt, as the press called it, involved Italian immigrants far more fully than the 1909 Shirtwaist Uprising. Its success rested on the cooperation between the Jewish majority and the Italian minority in the trade and between the 54,000 men and 6,000 women employed. Taking note of females participating in the strike, the WTUL distributed 209,000 free quarts of milk to strikers' children. After 2 months, the cloak and shirt makers signed a compromise agreement granting the preferential union shop a 50-hour week, 10 paid holidays, and bonus pay for overtime. This protocol of peace, though replete with anti-labor provisions, represented the first collective bargaining agreement in the industry and continued the shorter hours momentum. 30. In Chicago, despite opposition from the male-dominated and craft-oriented leadership of the United Garment Workers, UGW, women producing men's clothing at Hart, Schaffner, and Marx walked out over wages in September 1910. The wave of strikes that followed ultimately involved 40,000 workers, 10,000 of them women. The Chicago WTUL, with headquarters in the same building as the AFL, made the UGW place 2 WTUL members on the strike committee and policed the Chicago police on the picket lines. Nonetheless, the strike left 2 workers dead and brought 374 arrests. Thomas Rickard, the conservative head of the UGW, reacted to the tumult and to the rising numbers of immigrant women in his union by pressing for a quick settlement. In both early November and early December, he recommended agreements leaving the open shop intact. The rank and file rejected both and eventually won a union contract which established the 54-hour week, down from 57.5, a minimum wage, overtime at time and a half, and safety concessions at Hart, Schaffner, and Marx. However, the 30,000 strikers at other firms made no gains when Rickard Unilater Ally declared their strike over in February 1911. Socialist leadership and support was vital in the 1912 general strike of New York City furriers. Led by the United Hebrew Trades, that strike united about 7,000 Jewish fur workers with 2,000 Germans, Greeks, Italians, French Canadians, Bohemians, Slovaks, and others. It represented the most complete victory of multi-ethnic, shorter hours unionism in the pre-war clothing trades. Holding out for 13 weeks in order to force accession to the demand for a Saturday half-holiday, the furriers won a 49-hour week, 10 paid holidays, and time and a half overtime pay along with union recognition. 32. In early 1913, protocols calling for a 50-hour week came to cover 60,000 dress, shirtwaist, kimono, wrapper, white goods, and children's dressmakers after WTUL-sponsored strikes in New York and Boston. By 1915, when Chicago laid his cloak makers and some laid his glove makers there won the 50-hour week, shorter hours had reached most major northern clothing manufacturing centers. Gains then radiated outward to smaller cities. 33. For a time, the men's clothing industry remained an exception to the organizational successes in the clothing trades. However, this branch of the industry, with the rise of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, ACW, would see the fullest expression of socialist-led industrial unionism in the needle trades. Again, the working day was crucial. The discrediting of the Rickard leadership of the UGW grew from the leadership's betrayal of 3 major strikes, all of which involved the reduction of hours. Even before Rickard's capitulation in the Chicago walkout of 1910 discussed above, the UGW had ordered the end of a 1907 strike of New York City tailors, who sought a 53-hour week, and had expelled 9 locals for defying the order. The final straw in alienating the radical, often Yiddish-speaking, Tailors in the UGW from the leadership came on February 28, 1913, when Rickert called off a 9-week-old general strike among as many as 100,000 New York City men's clothing workers. The strikers, who sought a 48-hour week, union recognition, and a pay boost, gained next to nothing from the settlement. Rank and filers stayed on strike for 11 additional days and won the gradual institution of the 52-hour week, 48 for cutters. Partially victorious but thoroughly embittered, the union's militants would, within 2 years, follow the advice of the socialist writer Isaac Howard. If the tailors are to profit by the lesson of the strike, they must rid themselves of boss rule. If need be, by cutting loose from the national organization. After being outmaneuvered in an attempt to take leadership of the UGW, the left-wing majority of that group seceded and joined with the tailors' industrial union to form the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, ACW, representing 40,000 members, in December 1914.34. With such young socialist veterans of Chicago and New York strikes as Sidney Hillman, Joseph Schlossberg, and Bessie Abramowitz providing the leadership and with a mandate to prepare for the time when organization would put the working class in actual control of the system of production, the ACW pressed for more free time. The second resolution passed by the new organization called for a universal 8-hour day to lessen the evil of unemployment. In the first major ACW strike, waged by 25,000 Chicago men and women from September until December 1915, the 48-hour week headed a list of demands. Although the Chicago strike is usually considered to have been defeated, it did succeed in enlisting the support of Chicago Federation of Labor leaders, including John Fitzpatrick, and of top women reformers, including Jane Addams and Grace Abbott. During the 1915 walkout, the new union grew quickly. Workers returned to their shops not as unorganized men and women, the ACW history of the strike observes, but as members of a union. And they returned to the prospect of shorter hours. Much of the industry, voluntarily, adopted a reduced workweek just after the end of the strike, cutting hours to 48 or 50 weekly. By 1919, the ACW and ILGWU would successfully engage in a joint campaign to bring about the 44-hour week in the needle trades. Within 1 decade after the 1909 uprising, clothing workers had cut a dozen or more hours from their week's work, raised their wages, and built enduring unions. 35. The steel industry invited shorter hours agitation. Not only did its major corporation, U.S. Steel, boast of its success in maintaining an open shop, but the whole industry had a record of lengthening the working day. In the 1880s, Carnegie plants had experimented with the 8-hour day, but, after completion of mechanization, the employers held that the hard work had disappeared from most of steel production and turned to longer shifts. Forcing through the extant science during economic downturns, the employers instituted 12-hour days in much of the industry, beginning in 1887 and culminating with the conversions at South Works in Joliet, Illinois, between 1902 and 1904. By 1910, 30% of all steelworkers labored on Sunday, and the working week, according to figures compiled for Illinois, was 7 hours more than it had been in 1882. Once every 2 weeks, workers in many departments put in a 24-hour, long turn. 36. At the AFL's 1909 convention, the first resolution introduced called for thorough organization of all branches of the steel business. The AFL campaign to carry out that resolution in early 1910 emphasized labor's avowed desire for a normal workday and an American wage standard. However, the AFL's craft organization served as a poor vehicle for organizing in a mass production industry undergoing changes in the division of labor that diluted craft expertise and created a range of semi-skilled job classifications. The AFL unions, also hesitant to organize immigrants, committed only 6 organizers to the steel effort and had lost enthusiasm for the project when an hour's strike at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, presented new opportunities. 37. At Bethlehem Steel Company, skilled workers had a Saturday half-holiday. But they worked 10 hours and 25 minutes each of the other 6 days, 68 hours per week. The less skilled complained of a 13-hour and 20-minute workday. Since 1907, the company had refused to pay time and a half for overtime. On February 3, 1910, some of the skilled machinists at Bethlehem struck, demanding overtime premiums and an end to Sunday work. Shortly thereafter, unskilled laborers and apprentices joined their ranks. With the aid of AFL and International Association of Machinist Organizers, the local craft unionists pursued unity with the unskilled, mostly Hungarian immigrants. Appeals directed to ethnic clergymen drew little support outside of Hungarian Catholic parishes, but many laborers still stood by the machinists through much of the 108-day strike. The skilled workers also refused a separate settlement ignoring the unskilled. Even so, the strike never succeeded in shutting down the entire plant. Overtime and Sunday work became optional as a result of the settlement, but wages remained unchanged and so low that long hours remained a necessity. 38. Although the Bethlehem strike lost and although a summertime 10-hour initiative at McKees Rock failed, The events of 1910 changed labor relations in the steel industry. Reformers, especially the members of the Federal Council of Churches and John Fitch of the Pittsburgh Survey Group, relentlessly publicized conditions in steel factories in the wake of the Bethlehem strike. The entire industry, according to historian David Brody, stood implicated. The AFL and the reformers forced an investigation of the corporations and won support for requiring the 8-hour system on government-contracted steel. Moreover, the unskilled and immigrants no longer seemed beyond organization. Critically, craft lines gave way. Semi-industrial unionism, still fraught with problems but more apt to organize the ethnic unskilled, had come to the steel industry. When AFL organizing returned to the mills in 1913, with the goals of recognition and the three-shift system of 8 hours, agitational literature was printed in 13 languages. 39. In the lumber industry, the IWW led a 6-week strike of 3,000 Oregon sawmill workers in the spring of 1907, demanding 9 hours, 10 to 12 hours being the rule, and higher wages. It won wage concessions and established the union in the Northwest for the first time. By 1911, the largest IWW affiliate there organized around the 8-hour day, and in March 1912 the Wobblies led a huge walkout of unorganized Greek, Austrian, and Finnish sawmill workers at Grays Harbor, Washington, seeking 8 hours plus up to a 20% pay boost. Despite a sympathy strike among lumberjacks, the movement failed to overcome vigilantes and deportations. 40 in the South, the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, BTW, grew out of a 1907 general strike among Louisiana and East Texas lumber workers protesting, among other things, a lengthening of hours. That strike failed, but by December 1910, the BTW had taken shape. At first the BTW agitated for a 10-hour day, but after joining the IWW in 1912, the union raised its demand in November 1913 to an 8-hour day with time and a half for overtime. More remarkably, in a southern industry in which skill and race distinctions overlapped, the BTW abandoned segregated locals as it fought for more leisure. 41. In extractive industries, the bloodiest and most important of the period's labor disputes concerned the working day. It mattered little, in terms of the emphasis on the working day or in terms of the violence of the repression, whether the Wobblies or the UMW, the strongest industrial organization in the AFL, provided the leadership. Reduction of hours addressed the two major concerns of miners, safety and unemployment. The UMW led strikes in West Virginia in 1912 and 1913, involving 4,000 coal miners and described by one journalist as Civil War in the West Virginia coal mines, began with a series of demands featuring the 9-hour day, down from 10. The West Virginia strikes, during which IWW composer Ralph Chaplin was inspired to write the classic labor anthem, Solidarity Forever, featured mass arrests, gunplay, evictions from company housing, and a militancy that made even the socialist leader Eugene Debs the target of criticism from the left. They ended in a compromise that included a 9-hour clause. 42 in Colorado, the UMW's strike of 1913 and 1914 against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company involved over 10,000 coal miners, many of them Greek immigrants, who sought the 8-hour day and other reforms. The strike is best known for an unprovoked April 20, 1914, attack by the Colorado National Guard on the tent city in which the strikers camped. Machine gun fire and arson claimed as many as 32 lives in the Ludlow massacre. After federal intervention and nearly 9 more months of striking, the UMW called off the strike, defeated. In another extractive industry, Rockefeller interests took a less hard line, granting the 8-hour day in the California oil industry in 1917. The Oil and Gas Workers Union, an industrially organized AFL affiliate, secured the concession from Standard Oil of California with no strike and then led a whirlwind organizing campaign that lay the basis for an award of the 8-hour day in other California oil companies in a wartime mediation decision. In the metal mines, where transportation into the pits could add as much as an hour to the working day, hours were at issue in the 3 major strikes between 1906 and 1916. IWW strikes at Goldfield, Nevada, in 1906 and 1907 combined the issues of 8 hours and job control, union regulation over work and posting of schedules and wage scales, successfully. By spring of 1907, nearly every job in and around the gold mines adopted the 8-hour system at high wages. In a remarkable experiment in mass unionism, 1,500 miners united in the same union with 400 engineers, clerks, stenographers, teamsters, dishwashers, and waiters. 44 in the Michigan copper strike of 1913 and 1914, 16,000 minutes walked out to win the 8-hour day and concessions on wages and safety. Komishmen, Irishmen, Croats, Slovenes, Poles, Italians, and Austrians joined together under WFM auspices. The 9-month dispute established the 8-hour day, but at terrible cost. Mine owners instituted the reform as part of a backdoor work movement designed to destroy the union and, Although the strategy enjoyed no immediate success, the loss of the strike did help break the union. Worse, a 1913 Christmas party of strikers at Italian Hall in Calumet ended in 73 deaths, 62 of them children, when a false cry of fire caused a fatal stampede. 45 The Mesabi Range strike of 1916 began as a walkout over wages, but blossomed under wobbly leadership into a strike of 10,000 iron miners who placed a portal-to-portal 8-hour day at the head of their demands. Repression, including an accessory to murder indictment against 7 strike leaders, and waffling federal mediation helped ensure defeat of the strike, though wages rose as a result. 46. A list of other important shorter hours campaigns during the pre-war years would be long, but several deserve brief mention because they exemplify the issue's tendency to promote both solidarity and repression. The 1913 Buffalo, New York, strike of 4,000 retail workers reflected a growing demand for maximum hours laws, rather than just early closing, by clerks and salespeople who increasingly identified with trade union methods. The strikers, 80% female, prevented delivery of scab goods and paraded in defiance of civic authorities. Fewer than 3 weeks after its May Day beginning, the strike ended with the Merchants Association agreeing to an 8.5-hour day. In Los Angeles in 1910, a strike and lockout of 12,000 iron and metal workers seeking 8 hours and a raise formed the context of the celebrated prosecution of the McNamara brothers on murder charges growing out of a bombing. 6 years later, the equally celebrated bombing that caused the prosecution of labor organizers Thomas Mooney and Warren Billings took place amidst a long, tough, and successful strike for the 8-hour day by San Francisco's structural steel workers. At Akron, Ohio, in 1913, 14,000 to 20,000 rubber workers, responding to appeals in Serbian, English, Italian, and Hungarian, shut down the city's major factories demanding shorter hours in an unsuccessful wobbly-led strike. 47 In short, the years before Henry Ford's labor liberalizations and United States' entry into World War I witnessed massive labor activity around hours. This activity formed a part of the context for Henry Ford's decision to grant the 8-hour day. The manufacturers of automobiles, wrote Upton Sinclair in describing the pre-1914 period, were confronting a problem. The more men they had working, the more time these men wasted moving from one job to the next, and getting into each other's way. Henry Ford perceived 2 further problems. Unions of the radical IWW variety had made inroads in organizing in the open shop Bâtiment of Detroit, and Ford's new Highland Park factory suffered from astronomical turnover rates while it rationalized production. In 1914, Ford addressed all of these problems as he instituted a moving belt assembly line, a $5 daily wage, and the 8-hour day. In summarizing the goals of his labor policies as profit sharing and efficiency engineering, Ford neatly indicated how welfare capitalism and calculation regarding productivity mixed in his response to the problems of efficiency and labor unrest. 48. Scholars have long debated whether humanitarian or fiscal conditions predominated, but where the 8-hour day is concerned, it is impossible to disentangle the two. Ford was thoroughly committed to capitalist efficiency and to starting, in the words of his mentor, Thomas Edison, to make this world over through leisure. 49 Like most progressive reformers, but unlike most industrialists, he saw no contradiction between the two goals. His rationales were always self-interested but seldom hypocritical. Therefore, it is appropriate to discuss how Ford came to the 8-hour decision, and why few other industrialists followed, by beginning with Ford's own statements. Ford offered several reasons for the labor liberalizations of 1914. His most direct linking of such policies with the labor crisis occurred in a statement recalled by Joseph Galam, an official in the experimental toolroom. Mr. Ford, according to Galam, said he would lick the IWW by paying the men the $5 day. The 8-hour day was perhaps more pointedly designed to disarm the IWW, which had led a brief, unsuccessful strike of 5,000 Studebaker workers seeking 8 hours and had won the shorter day at 3 Detroit metal wheel factories during the previous year. 50 The Wobblies propagandized widely at Ford's factory gates, demanding 8 hours. Nor was the IWW in Detroit dying in early 1914, as the historian Alan Nevins would have it. Rather, it led thousands of jobless Detroiters on a demonstration in February of that year and carried out joint work with the AFL around the question of cutting hours to cure depression in the auto industry. While the IWW had probably not organized more than a 30th of Detroit's 60,000 auto workers, it had shown a capacity for influencing those who were not members. Moreover, the industrially organized AFL Carriage, Wagon, and Automobile Workers Union as well as AFL craft unions were organizing in the auto industry with some success. Thus, Ford's "lick the IWW" stance suggested also in his boast to a Detroit periodical that there will be no more excitement in Detroit's labor circles, deserves to be considered a serious motivation for his reforms. 51. In a second explanation of his rationale for the $5, 8-hour day, Ford said, "We have settled on the 8-hour day, because it so happens that this is the length of time which we find gives the best service from men, day in and day out. This notion that the institution of the 8-hour day was a matter of proven efficiency was based on no solid calculation showing the specific superiority of 8 hours. Still, Ford could point to several ways in which the new schedule served the company. The switch from 2 9-hour shifts to 3 8-hour shifts provided for an extra 6 hours of production. Although Ford later moved away from a full night shift, he held that expensive tools cannot remain idle. They ought to work 24 hours a day. In inaugurating 3 shifts, with only one 10-minute lunch break on each shift, Ford secured optimum use from his machinery. 52 Ford and his advisors also saw efficiency as served by the 8-hour, $5 day in that the new labor policy decreased turnover and absenteeism and increased labor discipline. Ford's Highland Park plant suffered problems in achieving a stable labor force between 1910 and 1913. In the latter year, Ford hired over 52,000 men to maintain a complement of 14,000 workers. 6 times as many employees quit as were fired. Absenteeism ran as high as 10% daily. 53. The high numbers of quits and truancies reflected alienation engendered by a rapid rationalization of production. In 1903, at the Mack Avenue factory, according to Ford, workmen fetched parts and material to one central location and built a car, exactly the same way one builds a house. By 1907, at the Piquette plant, 45 cars sat in a circle and specialized workers, or work groups, walked from one to the next performing a limited task. That same year, time and motion studies began at Ford, and foremen received orders to enforce standards based on calculations of engineers with stopwatches. If the first man does not come up to that standard, production supervisor Max Wallering wrote, "Try another." That was Henry's scheme of things. The tendency toward calculating production by the second accelerated with the building of the Highland Park plant. There, Ford mechanized material delivery systems in the foundry in 1912 and began to produce flywheel magnetos on a moving assembly line in April 1913. The magneto assembly, formerly done in about 20 minutes by a single skilled mechanic working at a bench, broke down into 29 separate tasks performed by 29 men at the chain-driven pace of 13 minutes 10 seconds total work per assembly. Efficiency experts juggled the line's speed to give every second necessary but not a single unnecessary second to the assemblers. In the fall of 1913, as the 8-hour decision approached, Ford men also pondered how to put assembly functions on a moving line. They knew, in September of that year, that stationary assembly required 12 hours and 28 minutes of labor time under ideal conditions. Within 6 months, that standard was cut to 1 hour and 33 minutes on a moving fine. 54. Immigrant workers referred to the Highland Park plant as the House of Correct Tions in 1913, and the IWW branded Ford the Speed-Up King. 55. Liberal labor policies could reward a workforce willing to put up with such constant changes toward more alienated and disciplined labor. During the first week of the application of the 1914 reforms, 1,000 workers, mostly Greeks and Serbs, were fired for taking off on a Greek Orthodox religious holiday. Working at Ford was to be a privilege. Liberal wages and hours were a matter for management, a gift and not a right. Dissident employees knew, as the engineers Horace Arnold and Fay Forode put it in their 1914 study, that the door to the street is open for any who objects in any way, by questioning obedience to any direct tions whatever. 56. Such division of labor also entailed an abandonment of mental work to management. Ford, although he sometimes held that the average worker, above all, wants a job in which he does not have to think, saw repetitive, purely physical labor as terrifying, and compensated by encouraging an intellectual life for workers, but only during hours after work. Man needs leisure to think, he wrote, and the world needs thinkers. He experimented with funding a variety of night and technical schools and delighted in finding employees who had unexpected skills, unrelated to their shop jobs. 57. The 1914 reforms, as Ford's educational activities suggest, not only compensated for alienated labor, but also sought to develop, through leisure, a more efficient workforce. Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, whose commentary on Americanism and Fordism remains indispensable, termed Ford's goal as the creation of a new type of worker and of man, thoroughly Americanized by night classes and utterly committed to morality, duty, and family. Lay shore, Ford insisted, would be used by the worker for the greater happiness of his family, and this orientation toward family was to ensure proper living among employees. The $5 wage was designed as a family wage, which would function by not only supplying the worker's basic need, but also in giving him a margin of comfort and enabling him to give his boys and girls their opportunity and his wife some pleasure in life. Ford refused to hire married women whose husbands had jobs and discouraged taking in boarders. Profit sharing, a large part of the $5 compensation, did not extend to young males without dependents, married men living alone, or men in the process of divorcing. Functionaries in the sociological department, formed immediately after the labor reforms to see that money and time were wisely spent, checked to see which men were living unworthily by drinking excessively, smoking tobacco, or defaulting on family obligations. 58. Efficiency meant both the creation of a stable, disciplined labor force on the job and the reproduction of that workforce through family life. Public and private considerations were inseparable. Indeed, John R. Lee, Ford personnel manager and first head of the sociological department, recalled that not until 1912 did management begin to realize something of the relative value of men, and that it did so after an investigation into declining production in a drop hammer operation revealed that sickness, indebtedness, and fear and worry over things entirely related to the home had crept in and put a satisfactory human unit entirely out of harmony with the things necessary for production. The calm. Payne's first response, cutting hours from 10 to 9 and raising wages 15%, set precedents for 1914.5. Although it is difficult to judge how much family life, temperance, and education benefited from Ford's labor reforms, productive efficiency was served. Labor turnover dropped by 90%, and absenteeism was at least halved. According to some figures, it plummeted from 10% to 0.3% per day. During the first week of the 1914 reforms, 14,000 job seekers descended on the Highland Park factory in search of now desirable employment. In departments where no technological or operational changes occurred, 8-hour productivity easily exceeded that formerly accomplished in 9. Ford could report that the $5, 8-hour day was one of the finest cost-cutting moves ever made. 60. However, Ford was after more than efficiency in the outflanking of the IWW in his 1914 actions. His further rationale for the new wage-hour system reinterpreted the role of leisure and consumption into a businessman's version of Ira Steward's philosophy. Like Steward, Ford saw less hours as generating increased demand for industrial products. Workers with more leisure, he wrote, have time to see more, do more, and, incidentally, they buy more. This stimulates business and increases prosperity, and in the general economic circle the money passes through industry again and back into the workman's pocket. Low unemployment. Ford once commented that he had considered instituting the 4-hour day in 1914 as a cure for joblessness, and higher wages would similarly contribute to a greater demand for goods. Wives are released from work, little children are no longer exploited, according to Ford, and, given more time, they both become free to go out and find new products, new merchants and new manufacturers. Not incidentally, Ford was engaged in mass marketing cars. People who have more leisure time, Ford held, have more clothes. They also, he added with some self-interest, must have more transportation facilities. 61. The key question regarding the relationship between Ford's institution of the 8-hour day and the policies of other employers is to what extent Ford's décision was idiosyncratic and to what extent it represented a corporate capitalist outlook shared by other employers. We argue that Ford's actions neither reflected nor sparked a broader tendency toward voluntary reduction of hours. In Detroit, where other automakers faced concerns like Ford's, the 1914 reforms met with their opposition. As the Socialist Party of Michigan expressed its appreciation of Ford in a pamphlet and as labor organizer William Z. Foster lauded the new labor policy, some among Ford's fellow automakers branded him a traitor to his class. John R. Lee later implied that bitterness over the 1914 reforms led to Ford's withdrawal from the Employers Association. Detroit industry cut hours grudgingly, and in 1920 many factories still operated on a schedule of more than 48 hours per week. General business reaction to Ford in 1914 was also negative. The Wall Street Journal criticized the new policies as an economic crime and an intrusion of biblical principles, where they do not belong. The New York Times branded Ford's actions as distinctly utopian and against all experience, and sent a reporter to ask Ford if he were a socialist. 62. Marion Cahill, who conducted a close study of voluntary reductions of hours during this period, concluded that not only did employers fail voluntarily to reduce hours but that they did not give the matter serious consideration. His survey of the welfare capitalist journal Human Engineering's 4 1911 issues, for example, yields just one example of an employer-initiated reduction. Cahill mentions 5 other examples of voluntary reductions between 1907 and World War I, the most important being among employers who belonged to the National Association of Lithographers who, in 1910, introduced the 8-hour day in an effort to keep the open shop. So slow was the pace of voluntary reform that in 1916 Henry Ford proposed to Woodrow Wilson that the latter include a national 8-hour law in his presidential platform. That Ford would make such a proposal bespeaks the lack of private corporate initiative in cutting hours. That Wilson declined reflects a continued ambivalence even among progressives toward legislative action regarding the working day. 63. During the half-century from the close of the Civil War until 1915, the federal government had played but a small role in limiting working hours. The Perry-ODIC passage of legislation providing the 8-hour day for federal employees not only failed to set a precedent for private industry, but disappointed organized labor when the courts and the federal agencies administered the laws so as to limit their coverage. Even the AFL-supported 8-hour federal employee law of 1912 was eroded when its stiff penalty provision was held by the Attorney General not to apply if workers engaged in labor on a mixture of federal and private contracts. 64. However, from 1916 to 1918, the federal government made an apparent change of course and engaged in activity that challenged long hours in private industry. This federal activity took several forms, the most significant of which included the Adamson Act, 1916, which provided the 8-hour day to some railroad workers, the Keating-Owen Child Labor Law, 1916, which provided an 8-hour maximum working day for children aged 14 to 16 working in industries engaged in interstate commerce, and the activities of the War Labor Policies Board and the War Labor Board in providing for the basic 8-hour day on war contracts. However, all these partial reforms came largely in response to agitation or threatened agitation by labor. The reforms of 1916 to 1918 began in the context of the 1916 re-election campaign of President Woodrow Wilson and of the need to ensure labor peace during war preparation and the actual fighting. Wilson and the Democrats, who had promised organized labor much and had delivered little during the president's first campaign and term, made skillful use of the hours issue in the 1916 election. Wilson, who inherited the Commission on Industrial Relations, CIR, from Taft, staffed that federal labor investigative agency with a mixture of moderate labor leaders, social reformers, and NCF members and excluded the more vociferous open shop advocates of the National Association of Manufacturers, led by the reform-minded Kansas City attorney Frank Walsh and S. Thruston Ballard, a Louisville miller whose winter wheat refinery was the world's largest and the first to institute the 8-hour day. The Circle's 1916 final report recommended federal and state laws enforcing a 6-day work week of 8-hour days along with a child labor law. Wilson benefited from his association with this CIR policy and from his signing of the Adamson Act. 65. Wilson did not take Henry Ford's, or the CIR's, advice and make out of the shops in 8 hours, one of his campaign slogans in 1916.66. Instead, he managed to identify himself as an 8-hour supporter without making any conclusive commitment to 8-hour legislation outside of the railroad industry and child labor. This he did principally by declaring in the fall of 1916 that the 8-hour day now undoubtedly has the sanction of the judgment of society in its favor and should be adopted as a basis for wages even where the actual work to be done cannot be completed within 8 hours. Wilson's statement actually applied to a limited point in the enforcement of railway labor laws, but organized labor seized it as a presidential seal of approval for 8 hours. Gompers campaigned for the president's re-election and later wrote, "I have never known a man either within or without the White House with whom it was so satisfactory to cooperate upon big matters as President Wilson." 67 During the campaign and the months of war which followed, the 8-hour day was a big matter, but one on which Wilson never took an unequivocal stand for federal action. Both the Adamson Act and the Keating-Owen Child Labor Law illustrate Wilson's political skill and the ambiguity of federal commitment to shorter hours. The demand for an 8-hour day among operating personnel on the railroads developed with stunning speed. The Hours of Service Act, a 1907 federal measure directed mainly at rail safety, required only 8 hours rest to punctuate 16-hour working days. Within a decade, the Adamson Act would make an 8-hour day the law of the land for railroads. After 1907, the four unions representing operators on the rails, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen, Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, and Order of Railway Conductors, began to discuss the 8-hour day at the local and division level. By 1913, the trainmen and conductors were readying joint action on the issue, and by 1915 a few southern rails had already switched to the new schedule. In 1915, the Big Four railway brotherhoods solidified plans for joint negotiations with the railway carriers and focused on the 8-hour day. On December 15, executives of the four unions and the executive committees of their regional committees voted to submit to their members proposals that in all road service 100 miles or less, 8 hours or less will constitute a day, except in passenger service. On runs of 100 miles or less overtime will begin at the expiration of 8 hours, and all overtime to be compensated on the minute basis and paid for at time and 1/2 times in prorate. Of those polled, 95% approved of submitting the demands to the carriers. 68. Both sides immediately began fierce public relations campaigns. The companies insisted that the 8-hour demand was no more than a ploy to gain higher wages through overtime, and that the 8-hour day would raise rail rates, reduce safety expenditures, and necessitate cutting wages of the 1,500,000 non-operating employees to meet the demands of the operators. 69. This last argument, however disingenuous, had the potential to divide the Big Four further from the rest of organized labor. None of the operating brotherhoods was affiliated with the AFL, and the Switchmen's Union, which represented non-operating personnel and which was part of the AFL, opposed support for the Big Four. Only the vigorous backing of Gompers, socialist unionists, and others who believed, in Gompers' words, that there is a big principle involved in the fight the road brotherhoods have been making. A principle which affects the interest and welfare of all, assured that the AFL would back the Big 4.70. The union's publicity stressed, as the title of one leaflet put it, that long hours cause death, by leading to poor health, accidents, and the crippling inju rise, which had increased fourfold from 1889 to 1910. Big Four officials also observed that if the roads wished to avoid higher wage bills from overtime, they had only to schedule fewer long shifts. Far from cloaking a wage measure in shorter hours rhetoric, workers were willing to accept less total wages in return for less hours. Reports of high profits for the major carriers buttressed the union's contention that transition to an 8-hour day was not impractical. 71. Negotiations on the issue began on June 1, 1916, in New York City with A. B. Garretson of the conductors speaking for the 400,000 members of the Big Four. Division chairman of 640 Brotherhood locals came to the conference where Elisha Lee of the Pennsylvania Railroad represented the National Conference Committee of Railroad Managers. Garretson proposed 8 hours with no cut from the existing 10-hour pay scales and refused to entertain counter-propose ALS for arbitration of all issues or for complex work rule changes which would have negated all pay raises stemming from overtime after 8 hours. Negotiations ceased on June 16. 72. With bargaining adjourned, the unions balloted. On August 8, the day negotiations reconvened, the Big Four announced that 94% of their members had opted to strike on Labor Day, September 4, for the 8-hour day. The Literary Digest headlined, "Facing Our Greatest Labor War, the Socialist New York Call" declared that the greatest attack on capital, in all U.S. history, loomed. The carriers continued a hard line, with Railway Age Gazette starkly stating, if the choice is between further concessions and a strike, then the strike should be allowed to come. After a brief attempt at mediation, all parties agreed that no progress was being made. 73. President Wilson, expressing fear that a general strike may be disastrous, asked to meet with the brotherhoods and carriers. In the midst of the 1916 election campaign, and under pressure from the AFL and a host of worried business groups, Wilson stepped into the railway dispute. He brought with him a modest record of supporting shorter hours and a suspicion of the railway corporations nurtured by experience in antitrust cases and by respect for the ideas of Lewis Brandeis. 74. On August 15, the day after the White House conference on the 8-hour day on the railroads began, Wilson tipped his moderate hand. 8 hours, he advised, but with arbitration of wage issues based on an inquiry into railroad finances. Wilson's stance, which one historian has termed a middle-of-the-road maneuver, had the effect of forcing each side to acknowledge whether the working day was the key issue or whether wages really were being discussed. It was in this context that Wilson declared, "I believe the 8 hours concession right. The 8-hour day now undoubtedly has the sanction of the judgment of society, and should be adopted." 75. As the unions debated the president's proposals, management rejected them. Without guarantees of higher rates, they argued, the carriers could not concede 8 hours. Since Wilson was legally powerless to offer such guarantees, the rejection was a blanket one and the carriers added bitter denunciations of the president for playing politics and undermining arbitration. Wilson replied that no mechanism to force arbitration then existed. By August 27, the corporations had tendered a pair of counterproposals. One provided for appointing an investigating committee and for outlawing strikes during the investigation. The second envisioned an interim period in which railroads kept both 10-hour and 8-hour books while an investigation occurred. The brotherhoods rejected both suggestions and, on August 28, the labor chairman began leaving Washington with secret orders authorizing a strike for September 4. When 3 chairmen leaked the strike plan to the press, Wilson summoned Garretson to the White House, where the latter confirmed the projected strike. 76. Faced with an impending walkout of 400,000 railwaymen, Wilson turned to Congress for help. Addressing a joint session on August 29, he upheld the 8-hour day as conforming to the whole spirit of the times and the preponderant evidence of recent economic experience, and then elaborated a complex proposal designed to placate the carriers. Alongside the 8-hour day were provisions to enlarge and reorganize the Interstate Commerce Commission, to appoint a committee to study the impact of the shorter day and make recommendations on wages and on freight rates, and, most controversially, to amend the Newlands Act so that it outlawed strikes and lockouts while an investigation of a labor dispute was in progress, and to empower the president to take over and operate the railroads, and draft personnel, in case of military necessity. The last 2 provisions caused the labor press to score Wilson's Slave Act weeks before the election. 77. The attitude of the unions toward proposed legislation, a historic initiative for shorter hours by political means, was mixed. Gompers, on the spot because of his longtime opposition to 8-hour laws for adult men in the private sector, reiterated that whatever progress has been made in reducing hours has been due to organized economic power. Nonetheless, the AFL had to enter the campaign for the 8-hour law both to prevent its anti-labor provisions from passing and to avoid abstaining in a historic victory that it had worked hard to achieve. Moreover, Gompers had accepted legislative regulation of hours for seamen the previous year. He eventually wired AFL bodies with instruction to telegraph both your senators and your congressmen, insisting upon the 8-hour workday at present compensation, and in your telegram emphatically protest against enactment of any law imposing upon American workers involuntary servitude. Similarly, although W.S. Stone of the Engineers and W.G. Lee of the Trainmen later expressed opposition to the Adamson Act, at the time of congressional hearings on the matter, neither spoke vigorously against the bill, and Lee gave every indication of favoring it, especially as a way to head off the impending strike. 78. Senator W.C. Adamson, chairman of the Commerce Committee, soon convinced Wilson that the rate increase and anti-strike provisions could not pass. On September 2, just in time to avert the strike, a simpler bill named for Adamson cleared the Senate 43-28 after passing the House by a 239-56 vote. Wilson signed the act in his private railway car, using 4 pens and then presenting one to the head of each railway brotherhood. A giant victory for labor, in that it gave the 8-hour day to operating railroad employees. The law also instructed Wilson to appoint a committee to report within 9 months on the fiscal impact of the measure and forbade railroads from lowering 8-hour wages below 10-hour standards in the interim. The unions canceled their strike, while Gompers' office issued a statement saying the brotherhoods still maintain their opposition to legislative methods. 79. The carriers resolved to fight the Adamson Act in the courts and refused to confer with the brotherhoods on its implementation. Answering management's threat to fight to the end, W.G. Lee observed that a strike vote is still in effect, and promised that the unions would play their strongest card on November 24, with no enforcement provisions made for a law slated to take effect on January 1, the carriers and government agreed to a speedy test case on the constitutionality of the law using an injunction secured by the Missouri, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad. In late December, Wilson's 8-hour commission reported that the Adamson Act was economically feasible and should be fully implemented. 80. Employers continued to ignore the law in January, and a re-elected Wilson renewed pleas for a ban on strikes during investigations of labor disputes. A January meeting of rail union chairmen agreed to delay a threatened strike on the matter. Socialists branded the unenforced Adamson Act the defeat of the railroad workers. On March 10, with all signs pointing to U.S. entry into World War I, the chairmen again met. This time they resolved to have implementation by March 17 or to strike. Wilson, appealing to the patriotism of all concerned, successfully requested a 2-day delay in the strike and turned the matter over to mediators from the Council of National Defense. Early in the morning of March 19, apprised by Wilson that under no circumstances would a strike be acceptable, the carriers agreed to implement the 8-hour law. Several hours later, the Supreme Court declared the law constitutional in a 5-4 vote, treating it as an 81 wage measure. In the wake of the Adamson Act, reformers committed to the 8-hour day burst with enthusiasm. Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma, a child labor reformer, announced that the shorter day would distribute happiness and property more equitably, while Frank Walsh, chairman of the Commission on Industrial Relations, rhapsodized. 1916 marks the beginning of the end of an industrial despotism which allows a few men to exercise autocratic control over the lives, mental aspirations and craving for happiness of countless producers. Wilson's 8-hour day plea will become the demand of the whole world's workers. 82. But the impact of the Big Four's victory was far more limited than the reformers allowed. The unions had won the 8-hour day at precisely the time when they were strong enough to take it. The victory did not automatically extend to other workers. Only a small number of organized switchmen also won 8 hours quickly in the wake of the Adamson Act. Ironically, the railroad shopmen, who pioneered in federated bargaining in the bitter, 45-month Harryman system strike, fought partly over 8 hours between 1911 and 1915, and defeated largely because operating brotherhood employees continued to work, remained unrewarded profits. What next? Socialist writer Jack Phillips asked. Will it be the shopmen next? Will the 80% of railroad workers outside the brotherhoods come next? The answer was complex, as the crazy quilt pattern of craft jurisdictions on the rails dictated that it would be, but ultimately the Adamson Act was to prove an important, but far from binding, precedent in securing the 8-hour day for non-operating personnel in shop crafts and telegraphy through wartime actions of the Rail Wage Commission. 83. The history of the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act is also marked by the exigencies of the 1916 election and by court challenges, which in this case set aside the law. Wilson had, between 1908 and 1912, firmly opposed federal child labor legislation. The National Child Labor Committee succeeded only in convincing Wilson not to speak against the Palmer-Owen Bill on child labor in 1914. Wilson did not protest either when Democratic Senator Lee Overman of North Carolina objected to the bringing of the Palmer-Owen Bill directly to the Senate floor in March 1915, thus ensuring that the bill, which had passed the House by a 5-0 margin, would die in committee. Nor, despite strong support for the May Assure from the AFL, NCL, U.S. Children's Bureau, and American Medical Association, did Wilson object when Overman again kept a child labor bill, the Keating-Owen Act, off the Senate floor on June 3, 1916.84. However, Wilson suddenly embraced the child labor measure and assumed a position of leadership in the campaign for reform. On June 16, the Democratic Convention, worried by possible defections of progressive voters to the Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party, adopted a platform plank favoring the speedy enactment of a federal child labor law. The Republicans did likewise, but it was Wilson who, by virtue of his refusal to accept formal renomination until the Keating-Owen Act passed, received credit for blocking Southern threats to filibuster. On September 1, Wilson signed the Keating-Owen Act into law. In accepting renomination the next day, he pointed to a record which included the emancipation of the children of the nation from hurtful labor, 85. The Keating-Owen Act did not end child labor. It did forbid from interstate commerce the products of mines and quarries where children under 16 were employed and the products of mills, factories, canneries, and workshops where children under 14 were employed or children between 14 and 16 worked more than 8 hours a day. But such provisions covered only about 1 in 14 of the nation's nearly 2 million child laborers. One federal court declared the Keating-Owen Act unconstitutional even before it took effect. In that case, Hammer v. Dagenhart, the Southern cotton manufacturers challenged the Keating-Owen Act before Judge James E. Boyd of North Carolina. Boyd, an opponent of child labor laws, ruled on August 13, 1917, granting a permanent injunction holding the law unconstitutional. He cited no precedents and appended no written opinion, but his order barred federal district attorneys in his jurisdiction from prosecuting child labor violators. 9 months later, the U.S. Supreme Court sustained Boyd on an appeal of Hammer v. Dagenhart. By a 5-4 vote, the High Court held that if the principles embodied in the child labor law were upheld, all freedom of commerce will be at an end and the power of the states over local matters may be eliminated, and thus our system of government be practically destroyed. 86. The activities of the War Labor Board, WLB, and War Labor Policies Board, WLPB, further brought ours, trade unions and politics together. A 1918 report of the Executive Council of the AFL began, as might easily have been predicted, the most important issue in war production has been the application of the 8-hour law. Such a prediction could have been based not only on the exigencies of war production, which occasionally required long shifts, but on the militancy with which workers had demanded the 8-hour day before the war. In 1916, for example, more workers were on strike than in any year, save one, during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. 87 of the 2,501 strikes whose cause is enumerated in the American Labor Yearbook covering that year, 110, or 4.4%, involved only the issue of hours, and an additional 490, or 19.6%, involved hours in combination with other issues. Over 340,000 workers secured the 8-hour day that year. In 1917, despite wartime attempts to foster labor peace and attempts to bring voluntary compliance with the 8-hour day, comparable statistics show 4.3% pure hour strikes and an additional 15.1% partially involving hours. Over 500,000 workers gained the 8-hour system in the first half of 1917 alone. 88. Labor protest around the issue centered in the most sensitive war industries. In addition to the railway agitation surrounding the Adamson Act, there was the Mesabi Range strike of Minnesota iron ore miners. Even more dramatic were the munitions strikes, which began in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in 1915 and continued there through 1918. These strikes spread to arms factories throughout Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, as well as to the Westinghouse Facto Rise producing shells and airplane engines in the Pittsburgh area. All these strikes revolved around the 8-hour day and most were successful. The Bridgeport and Westinghouse strikes deserve attention as illustrations of the mood of labor militancy, the tendency toward industrial unionism and even workers' control, and the continuing capacity of the hour's demand to generate unity. 89. In Bridgeport, where time study and incentive pay had come to the metalworking industry by 1910, a socialist-led lodge of the International Association of Machinists grew dramatically with the war orders of 1915. Threat of a strike caused the huge Remington Arms plant to concede the 8-hour day in August of that year, a month after a short walkout by 125 women workers at Remington won the 8-hour demand. By December 1915, as a result of a summertime citywide strike, 23,000 Bridgeport machinists won the same concession. The largest Bridgeport munitions strikes prior to American entry into the war involved wage rates rather than hours, but weeks after that entry the Union began a series of brief, rolling strikes to generalize the 8-hour system and to institute an elaborate system of Union control over job classifications and activity ties on the shop floor. Leadership by ex-Wobbly Samuel Lavitt and by Edwin O'Connell engineered impressive unity between skilled and unskilled workers, between native-born Americans and immigrants, and between men and militant women strikers who joined the walkouts even though largely barred from craft union membership. The unions stressed shorter hours and a simplification of the wage structure in a campaign that culminated in massive strikes in May and June 1918. The LAM formally secured the 8-hour day, which already was established in most shops, as part of an August 28, 1918, settlement by the National War Board. 90. The Westinghouse strike of 1916 began on April 21 when 2,000 workers at Westinghouse Electric in East Pittsburgh walked out for the 8-hour day. Organized by the locally powerful American Industrial Union, the strike reflected that organization's commitment to organize workers in all industries in the Pittsburgh district, without regard to age, creed, race, sex or craft. By the second evening 13,000 Westinghouse workers, 3,000 of them women, had struck against Westinghouse, one of the largest fully tailorized corporations. At a strike meeting, they sang their demands: all we want is an 8-hour day. With 9½ hours pay, 91. Within 4 days the strike spread to 4 Westinghouse plants in the area and involved 36,000 employees at Westinghouse Electric and Westinghouse Machine alone. The IAM, spurred on by the accomplishments of the AEU, sent in 16 organizers. The IAM and AEU issued a joint call for a regional general strike to enforce the 8-hour day on May 1 and as many as 20,000 strikers, many of them foreign bomb, marched to U.S. Steel's Edgar Thompson works in an effort to spread the walkout. 1,000 company guards fought the demonstrators, killing 3 and wounding 3 dozen. Pennsylvania's governor then ordered 1,000 National Guardsmen to the Westinghouse Electric plant, and after leaders were arrested, the strike was broken. But the 1916 8-hour actions at Westinghouse sparked a series of other shorter hours protests. Mediators headed off strikes in several other machinist munitions disputes by granting concessions regarding hours. 92. Despite these indications of resolve to win shorter hours by workers in key industries, many industrialists, not corporate liberals on this issue, remained unwilling to grant the 8-hour day, even as a war measure. Iron Age, a trade organ of the metal industry, proclaimed that the unparalleled situation which has made victory in Europe turn not only upon sheer tonnage and steel projectiles, but upon the metal cutting capacity of American mechanic tools, must not be allowed to settle for years to come so important an issue as the 8-hour machine shop day. The president of the National Founders Association decried the 8-hour day at that group's 1917 and 1918 conventions, calling for its abolition. The NAM reiterated its opposition to the shorter day. Individual manufacturers complained that the limited pro-8-hour policies of the government caused labor strife. The story, they argued, came to the men and made them believe they would eventually get an 8-hour day. 93. Nor was the anti-8-hour sentiment confined to small unenlightened producers. The National Industrial Conference Board, articulating a reform philosophy based on cooperative action between government, business, and labor, issued a series of research reports, arguing that maximum efficiency would be obtained with a work week of more than 48 hours. And U.S. Steel, in other ways a model of welfare capitalism, remained a fierce holdout against shorter hours. 94. The first clash of a labor movement wanting shorter hours, a reluctant corpo-rate elite, and a government bent on efficient war production came in February 1917 when, according to an AFL Executive Council report, the forces, hostile to according labor any rights, assumed it to be a propitious moment to launch an agitation for repeal of the 8-hour law of 1912.95 in debate on the Naval Appropriations Bill. 3 congressmen asked whether an amendment ought not to provide the president with power to suspend the 8-hour law in emergencies. Gompers wrote House Speaker Champ Clark to argue that no amendment was needed, since existing legislation already included the proviso, except in case of extraordinary emergency. 1 month later the AFL nonetheless supported an amendment that empowered the president to suspend the 8-hour day on government work in cases of national emergency. Wilson signed the bill on March 4 and within 3 weeks suspended the 8-hour law in Navy yards, on all contracts for ordnance and ordnance stores and other miliary supplies, on arsenal or fortification building, and, incredibly, among workers distributing seeds for the Department of Agriculture. 96. Gompers regarded the March Amendment as a labor victory that completely protects the basic 8-hour day. Such a position shows the defensiveness of the AFL leadership at a time when it could have made major demands, including a national 8-hour law for all workers or, as Gompers once proposed, a 7-hour day. 97 Far from a victory, the amendment allowed the president to sweep away the actual 8-hour day in industry after industry in favor of the basic 8-hour day. In accepting the basic 8-hour day, the AFL implicitly accepted the idea that long hours meant greater production, an idea the organization had fought for years. The basic 8-hour day also opened the AFL to charges that it had no real interest in hours and merely sought higher wages through overtime. Finally, the amendment violated the wishes of many AFL members who, according to an American Federationist article in 1918, wanted an actual 8-hour day. 98. In practice, it proved hard to differentiate between war labor and the rest of industry, and reformers in the government attempted to extend the basic 8-hour day to greater numbers of workers. Newton Baker, Secretary of War and a supporter of the shorter hours work of the National Consumers League, appointed the young lawyer and Professor Felix Frankfurter to act on behalf of the War Labor Board in clarifying application of the 8-hour provisions. Frankfurter, a disciple of Brandeis and a backer of shorter hours mainly on the grounds of efficiency, faced a troublesome situation. In many cases, workers in the same factories engaged on different articles were treated differently. He blamed this situation for a great many labor troubles. In his position as Secretary of the War Labor Policies Board, WLPB, formed in May 1918, Frankfurter attempted to remedy the situation and to serve the cause of a shorter working day by bringing the basic 8-hour day to general application. Though the 8-hour system was by no means universally applied, progress was made. WLB estimates held that over 925,000 workers received the 8-hour day during 1917 and the first half of 1918. Frankfurter soon served notice that he considered hours a part of the determination of wages and intended to move against U.S. Steel, the leading defender of the 12-hour day. 100. The steel industry stood as the great example of the unevenness of wartime controls on hours and, as an open shop committed to setting its own conditions of work, of industrial refusal to make concessions on hours. At its South Bethlehem plant, for example, Bethlehem Steel briefly granted the basic 8-hour day only to workers laboring exclusively on government contracts, sparking protests from machinists and electrical workers in other parts of the plant. On April 16, 1918, it suddenly reverted to the 10 and 5/12 hour day it had used before the war, paying no time and a half bonus for overtime beyond 8 hours. Government investigators from the WLB treated the Bethlehem steel barons harshly. While America is sacrificing a generation of its best men, the executives of the steel company are devoting most of their attention to perpetuate feudal control of labor. Bethlehem's operating head, Eugene Grace, tried to refuse compliance with WLB directives to correct abuses at the plant, but in the face of a strike, WLB co-chairman William Howard Taft and Frank Walsh required his compliance on the issues of hours, wages, and the election of shop committees to represent workers. 101. In one sense, the public contention between Frankfurter and U.S. Steel head, Elbert H. Gary was unnecessary. Frankfurter, in attempting to apply the basic 8-hour day to the steel industry, acknowledged that labor was short and an actual 8-hour day should not be implemented. The issue thus turned on wartime wages for overtime. And, as James Weinstein has written, the cost of the increase in wages due to the adoption of the basic 8-hour day could be passed on to the government in higher prices for war orders. 102 Still, the fact that Frankfurter saw the campaign as part of a crusade for shorter hours and that Gary reacted as if the steel industry had been attacked, gave their differences symbolic importance. Frankfurter first asked Gary's cooperation and invited U.S. Steel to work with the WLPB on July 9, 1918. Gary, sensing reforms to come, stalled and pleaded that he was too busy with war production to meet. After Frankfurter sent a memorandum on long hours in the steel industry, Gary opened a further breach between his company and the board by calling a meeting of 150 steel manufacturers at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York on August 26. Gary announced that steel workers favored both long hours and the open shop. Acting as the steel industry's spokesman, he evaded meeting with Frankfurter to discuss the 8-hour day until September 20, 1918. At the meeting, Gary railed at 8 hours as a ruse to get higher wages, but Frankfurter threatened government action, including making Henry Ford the umpire on the hours question in steel. The Iron and Steel Institute announced that the industry had adopted the basic 8-hour day as a war measure 5 days later. Gary had towed the line, happy perhaps to have kept the open shop. The war was to last just 6 more months. After its close, much of the steel industry returned to extremely long schedules. Despite high, and what one historian calls, naive, hopes among reformers, war policy in steel set no lasting precedents. 103. Indeed, despite the efforts of Frankfurter, Baker, and others, the entire record of the WLB, the clearinghouse for labor disputes, remained quite mixed. Board policy on the hours of labor was that the basic 8-hour day is recognized as applying in all cases in which existing law required it. In all other cases the case Tion shall be settled with due regard to governmental necessities and the welfare, health and proper comfort of the workers. 104. In applying this standard, umpires from the board did not, as Cahill suggests they did, almost invariably, award the basic 8-hour day. A Bureau of Labor Statistics report from 1921 offers the best summary of the WLB's decisions on hours with the phrase, "No general rule established." Although the basic 8-hour day was obtained as a result of more board rulings than any other system, in numerous cases the arbitrators left longer schedules intact. Longshoremen in the South Atlantic continued on 10-hour shifts. The schedule of 57.5 hours per week for night workers at American Locomotive in Richmond passed the board unscathed. Nor did the basic 8-hour day apply to street railway employees or workers in coastwise or deep-sea shipping or in harbors. Even after the adoption of a clause providing time and a half for overtime after 8 hours by the WLPB in June 1918, no clear 8-hour policy was set. 105. The biggest union success in securing shorter hours during the war, that of the packing house workers, shows strikingly how solidarity and organization can deter one towards. The stockyards, an open shop, had witnessed a phenomenal scion of labor on, to use David Brody's pun, the disassembly line. As skills were undermined, jobs often became the provenance of one or more of the many ethnic groups who crowded the packing house neighborhoods. By 1909, 43% of the workers in the 4 major centers were East European bomb. More than 1 packing worker in 10 in Chicago was female. By 1918, over 20% of the Chicago packing workers were black. The unemployed shaped up outside the gates in the early mornings ready to underbid each other for jobs. 106. These, clearly, were the unorganizable. And yet, in a matter of months, they were organized, the first unionized mass production industry in the United States. Impetus for meatpacking unionization came from an unlikely alliance. William Z. Foster, working as a railway carman in Chicago, later wrote of the simple origins of the movement. One day as I was walking to work and I remember well that it was July 11, 1917, it struck me suddenly that perhaps I could get a campaign started to organize the workers in the great Chicago packing houses. That night Foster got the approval of the district council of his carmen's union. 2 nights later, the butcher workmen, a small craft union in the yards, agreed. On July 15 the 2 unions secured approval from the Chicago Federation of Labor, CFL, to initiate an organizing drive. John Fitzpatrick, the head of the CFL, gave enthusiastic support. Within 2 weeks the Stockyards Labor Council, an experiment in federation embracing butchers, carmen, machinists, electricians, coopers, carpenters, office workers, steamfitters, engineers, firemen, and other trades with jurisdiction in the yards emerged. With black organizers supported by the Illinois Federation of Labor, with volunteers from the Chicago WTUL, and with 2 Polish and Lithuanian organizers supported, as it turned out, by the packers and acting as spies, the Stockyards Labor Council slowly organized, concentrating on minority and unskilled workers. The 500 recruits who signed up in 6 weeks seemed paltry to Foster, but Fitzpatrick continued to be enthusiastic. 8 hours, a Fitzpatrick crusade, and the right to organize were the key selling points from the earliest day. 107. By November workers flocked to the renascent unions. Dennis Lane, craft-conscious head of the butcher workmen, saw this as resulting in part from his planting recruits at organizing meetings. The plants, waving dues money and signing up enthusiastically, broke the ice and others followed. To Foster, the convening of a national meeting of the packing house trades after a series of small strikes in western cities was crucial. Those as the meeting, held on November 11, 1917, in Omaha, drew up a coherent set of demands and enabled the organizers to conjure up threats of a massive strike in Chicago papers. At the first butcher workmen meeting after the Omaha Conference, 1,400 workers signed up. By year's end, according to the President's Mediation Commission, between a fourth and a half of all packing house employees had joined unions. 108. In wake of the Omaha meeting and of the Big Five packers' refusal to bargain, union members overwhelmingly voted to authorize a strike. An informal national federation of stockyards unions took shape, headed by Fitzpatrick and with Foster as secretary. But before any strike plans could mature, the Wilson administration pressed for labor peace to ensure uninterrupted meat production to fill war orders. In some of his memoirs, Foster stressed that he and fellow organizer Jack Johnston campaigned against such government interference, and for a strike to force the packers to sign a union agreement, adding that Fitzpatrick also distrusted the government's intentions. Still, the federated trades and the Big Five signed a no-strike, no lockout pledge for the duration of the war on Christmas 1917.109. President Wilson requested that the two sides come together in Washington. On January 25, Secretary of Labor W.B. Wilson brought labor and management to an initial accord. No preferential union shop, no grievance committees, and no recognition of unions in return for concessions on employment and shop conditions. Wilson appointed federal judge Samuel B. Alschuler to arbitrate all other issues. With members flocking to the unions, Alschuler held hearings in Chicago from February 11 until March 7, 1918. Having heard Frank P. Walsh, Fitzpatrick, and rank and filers present the union's case, and with Fitzpatrick worrying aloud that the unions will be unable to prevent a walkout if the décision is not announced immediately, Alschuler ruled on March 30. Degree he granted, even according to the skeptical Foster's reckoning, 85% of the union's demands, including the basic 8-hour day with time and a quarter for overtime and a 20-minute paid lunch. At an Easter Sunday meeting of 40,000, Fitzpatrick announced the agreement and added, "It's a new day, and out in God's sunshine you men and you women, black and white, have not only an 8-hour day but you are on an equality." One other point regarding war labor policy needs emphasis. The cooperation of the AFL with the war effort signaled brief legitimation of its place in society but also exposed those elements in the labor movement who did not support the war to fierce repression, which sometimes rebounded to victimize AFL unions as well. For example, in the Northwest lumber fields, a war industry by virtue of its production of spruce for airplanes, the IWW had organized the Lumber Workers' Industrial Union, LWIU, which had 6,000 members at the time of its 1917 founding convention, 1 month before American entry into the war. The Wobblies led a successful 8-hour strike in parts of Washington and Idaho that spring and planned further actions, especially in Washington's Douglas fir industry. The AFL, reacting to IWW successes, revived its moribund affiliate in the region and issued a general strike call for July 16. The Wobblies set their own general strike for July 17. The Lumbermen's Protective Association uncompromisingly defended the 10-hour day. For 6 weeks much of Northwest lumber production remained tied up as employers used private police, local sheriffs, attorneys, and federal officials to try to break the IWW. Sympathy strikes in Northwest shipyards proliferated. The AFL, which played little part in the strike, tried to appeal for recognition by the owners as a moderate alternative to the IWW. The president of Washington's AFL served on an investigating committee, which warned against the subversive IWW. But, as Melvin Dubofsky has shown, the employers had as little use for negotiating with the patriotic AFL as with the pro-German IWW. 2. The War Department and the Labor Department made repeated pleas to the lumbermen to grant the 8-hour day and to recognize AFL unions in order to undercut the IWW. When the employers proved unreceptive and when imprisonment of IWW leaders failed to restore production, the military entered the lumber labor picture with the dispatch of Lt. Col. Bryce Disk to survey labor conditions in the Northwest. Gompers supported Disk's anti-IWW mission, hoping that the Army would aid AFL organizers. Disk persuaded the timber owners to accept the 8-hour day in February 1918, but also broke both the IWW and AFL unions and set up a company union, the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, in their stead. 113. Already in Pacific Northwest events, the policy of AFL Government Cooperation had begun to unravel. In the months to follow, 8-hour, or 6-hour, strikes, intimately connected to issues regarding union recognition and control over work, erupted in mining, meatpacking, the needle trades, and steel. Government repression came increasingly to concentrate on AFL unions and charges of radicalism were especially leveled at industrial unionists inside the AFL. The AFL, which had grown from 1,946,347 members in 1915 to 2,726,478 members in 1918, was in a position to press for realization of the gains promised by wartime cooperation. Corporations, meanwhile, resolved to defend the open shop and their ability to set conditions of employment, especially hours. The mood of expectancy in industrial relations was summed up in a phrase by the young J. Lovestone, then a leftist: "Wait till the war is over." 4.